Welcome back, everyone. This is your host, the DN WhatIf, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of What If Deku's Quirk Told Him What to Do? A special shout out to the original creator, akcugrai. This is the permission statement by the author in written. Please make sure to show your support by checking out their work from the description. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. Alright Izuku, are you ready to go? Mama asks, crouching so she's level with Izuku. Lunch, backpack, uniform? There's a soft nudging at his hands, a reminder that he needs to get something. I have those, but, I need one more thing. Izuku knows there is something else. What? The feeling of a nudge changes to a soft pull at his wrist, like someone gently tugging at him. This way. Oh, alright then. Mama says, taking his hand and following him to the closet. Izuku opens the door and reaches onto a shelf above his head. His hand finds a box and he pulls it down to see it. Band-aids. The feeling of a soft pull shifts to settle down, a quiet reassurance of a job well done. Oh, Band-aids. Mama says with an easy smile. What a good idea, Izuku. A good start to his first day of preschool. Another kid scrapes his knee that day. Before he can begin to cry, Izuku is already there with his band-aid. His teachers praise him for being so helpful and he gets an extra star on the chart. That was all it is for a while. A few little intuitions. His hand twitches toward the umbrella as he's walking out the door and it rains unexpectedly. His hands twitch around problem 4 on his homework and he finds he'd made a mistake. He brings an extra pencil and gives it to a peer just when a test is starting. Simple things. He finds he has a certain affinity for plants. His hands always guide him to do the right thing. Just the right amount of water, just the right amount of sunlight. When he's 5, he notices a pair of strange freckles on the backs of his wrists. As he watches, they shift slightly. Curving dark lines begin to grow out of them, like drawings of vines which flow across his skin. They stretch out toward his fingers and wrap around his knuckles. They're almost black, with the slightest sheen of green flickering across them. Izuku watches them for a while, and they guide him to one of his mom's ferns, and he nudges the fronds until the vines around his hands seem content. They shift away again, settling into the pair of freckles on the backs of his wrists. Izuku thinks it might grow out better this way. Izuku can never quite explain the way that the lines speak to him. It's nothing like words. And it's not quite just the shapes that the vines play out along his hands. There's something deeper underneath, across his whole chest, like his entire body is being pulled toward whatever it is he needs to do. His mother doesn't understand, but is excited with him and takes him to the quirk doctor. They name it Green Grower and write down that Izuku can make plants grow well. Izuku tries to explain that it's more than just that, but they tell him that it's a lovely quirk and that it's all he needs. He gives up after a little while. His quirk pulls at his hands just in time to save the doctor's clipboard from falling off the desk. Izuku doesn't mention it. When he and his mom get home, they bake a cake together to celebrate how big Izuku has gotten. Izuku thinks that maybe it's alright. Izuku thinks about being a hero, but there's no familiar tug at his hands. He hugs his mom and decides to trust his quirk. It starts with simple suggestions. One day after school, it guides him to an unfamiliar classroom. He opens the door to find the fashion club. Izuku joins. Izuku doesn't need to think much. He drifts through life with an absent smile and always had just the thing for the job. He's content, helping other people and being helped by his quirk. He finds that he doesn't need much more than that. The bullying starts after they learn about his quirk. They call him names. Wallflower. Useless. But it doesn't last long. The first time was one day when Izuku was walking down the hallway at school. His hands tug him to the left instead of the right, and he does. He stumbles on the janitor mopping the floor and he pauses in confusion. Just a moment after he rounds a corner, some other middle schoolers, led by their ringleader Kaken himself, come running after him. He simply steps to the side and the kids slip on the water covering the floor. They go sliding across the hallway and Izuku shrugs at the janitor before slipping away in the other direction. The kids that Kaken led stop bothering Izuku, their pride a little too damaged to try and humiliate him again. He brings extra snacks to the fashion club and is invited to weekly game nights. He learns how to sew, how to change apparent body shape with the cut of his pants, and how to change his face with makeup. He follows the example of the other club members and dyes his hair new colors and tries new styles often. Kaken never really changes, but suddenly there are other people in the class who are willing to stand up to him. Izuku trusts his quirk. When he's 11 years old, his quirk asks him to rob a bank. Well, it doesn't exactly ask him. All his quirk can do is tell him to do something or go somewhere. So his quirk really just pushes him to buy a ski mask, a hammer, a gun that looks real aside from the bright orange nozzle, and some black paint. Izuku gets the idea. The question was whether he should trust what his quirk was telling him to do. He decides to go with it. At the very least, it seems interesting. He paints the nozzle of the fake gun with the black paint. It actually almost looks real. Izuku wears black clothes, a black backpack, and black gloves. On the day which his quirk instructs, he leaves home and walks to a bank. He hesitates for a few moments outside, then follows the feeling in his gut and enters. He takes a strange sort of winding way through the lobby, and Izuku realizes that he's avoiding the cameras. A minute after he enters, an explosion goes off from the back room of the bank. Izuku ducks into one of the cubicles and pulls on the mask. Alarms went off from all around them, and Izuku peeks around the edge of the cubicle. "Put your head down," shouts the leader. "If you're smart, you might just get out of this in one piece." "Yeah, what he said," shouts another. Around a dozen villains wearing almost the same thing as Izuku stream into the lobby from the back room, bags of valuables strapped to their backs. Izuku stares at them. It was almost something out of a movie. "Thu," the leader shouted, pointing at where Izuku is half hidden. "Get out of there, we've got to get out of here quick, stop your lollygagging." That was a word that this man had decided to use. Izuku stands up and slips into their pack, holding his gun like it's real. He's the shortest person in the group, but not by much. He fits in almost perfectly. "We're stealing your stuff," a woman next to Izuku shouts. "Yeah," Izuku shouts in solidarity. They walk right out the front door and into the van that pulls up to the curb. Izuku thinks that this might have been more than he bargained for. The back of the van is empty save for the benches bolted on both sides. Izuku follows the group and slips into one of the seats. There are no seat belts, so Izuku just holds onto the metal handle bolted onto the wall beside him. The van screeches away from the curb, taking Izuku with it. It keeps moving with breakneck speed through the streets, taking a sharp turn every few seconds. The man next to Izuku sighs theatrically. "That was something, wasn't it? Honestly, I was expecting some heroes or something. How disappointing," he says, slouching into his seat. He pulls a pack of cigarettes and lit one with the flick of his finger, some kind of fire quirk. He puts the cigarette in his mouth and offers the box to Izuku. Izuku takes one to be polite, though he doesn't have a lighter. Also, he is under the impression that 11 years old is too young to smoke cigarettes. But the man soon becomes distracted with talking to the person with horns on the other side of him. "Wait a second," the leader from earlier shouts from the front. He's standing between the driver and passenger seat, hanging onto a handle in the ceiling. He's counting everyone in the van. "Didn't we have 11 people?" Izuku's heart lurches in his chest. "No," the man beside Izuku responds. "We got 12. I mean before the bank." The leader corrects. "I was certain we had 11. Now everyone is occupied with counting the number of people in the van, getting in each other's way and moving so much that no one can get a good count. The fact that the van is still swaying and turning doesn't help." "Did you count yourself?" someone calls. "Of course," the leader says. "Did you count the driver?" I forgot the driver," the leader crows, wheeling toward the front of the car. The attention of the car moved to the six-armed man concentrating intently on the road. He's also wearing a ski mask. Izuku sees a giant tree branch barreling towards the van, before the six-armed man takes a sudden right turn to dodge it. "What's the next turn, boss?" There's more important things to worry about," the leader shouts. "Actually, no there aren't. You were the missing person." Boss," one bank robber asks, "if you missed the driver, doesn't that mean we now have 13 people?" The leader stares at her. "Oh no," he whispers. "Two imposters." The van descends into chaos. "The group chat," shouts the man beside Izuku. "Everyone write what they look like in the group chat." Then we can find these imposters. Everyone takes out their phones, and Izuku takes out his too, blindly hoping that this was part of his Quirk's plan. Izuku suddenly feels a very strong urge to take the phone of the man next to him. The car lifts off the ground. It doesn't flip, rather it just starts to go upward. Izuku holds onto his handhold tight and stares past the other passengers and through the windshield. Mount Lady stares back at him. Her face is larger than the windshield. Someone shoots a blast of light at her eyes. She shouts and flinches back, but thankfully doesn't drop the van. She sets it down roughly on the top of a building. Izuku manages to grab the phone of the man next to him during the chaos. Someone throws open the back doors of the van. Izuku stands and grabs one of the duffel bags from the floor, then follows as everyone jumps out. They scatter. Izuku's Quirk sends him to the left and he starts to run. Behind him, he hears the sound of Kamui Woods starting to fight. Izuku runs to the edge of the building and sees that the next one was only a few feet lower and maybe 7 feet away from the one he is on. He jumps, landing mostly on his feet and continuing onward. His Quirk sends him to one of the rooftop doorways. He tries it and finds it locked. He panics for a second before remembering that he has a hammer. With a vague sense of guilt, he smashes the door handle. Izuku sends one last glance at the fighting behind him. Kamui Woods is trying to pin down the villains while Mount Lady is rubbing her eyes and holding the driver in one hand. Izuku rushed through the door, leaving the fight behind him. Then he shucks off his mask as he walks down the stairs. He stuffs the bag he'd grabbed into his backpack and tries to make his face as calm as he can. He gets to the lobby. People are standing around, glancing idly out the front windows at the sounds of the fight. His Quirk isn't saying anything, so Izuku decides to stay put. He finds a couch and pretends to browse his phone for a while. Eventually the sounds of fighting die down, and people start leaving. Izuku follows. So it turns out his Quirk did have a plan after all. Izuku walks home. Once he's back in the apartment, he calls out for his mom. No response, so she isn't home, at work then. He trudges to his room and slumps into his chair. After a few minutes of sitting there, he finally sits back up and grabs his backpack, taking out the hammer, bag, and fake gun. He then opens the duffel bag which he grabbed from the pile in the van and pulls open the zipper. His brain short-circuits. Inside is more money than he has ever seen in one place. Maybe even more than Mom has in her bank account. Not knowing what else to do, he closes the bag tightly, then shoves it under his bed. After some prodding from his Quirk, he removes it and instead shoves it into a cubby in his closet. In plain view of anyone who entered his room. Izuku shifts between his feet and bites his lip, fighting between the urge to hide the bag somewhere sneakier and listening to his Quirk. Eventually the Quirk's history of success wins and he returns to his desk defeated. Izuku pulls out the phone he'd taken. It's an older model but not that old. He presses the home button experimentally and it opens to a lock screen. He stares at it for a long second, then feels a twitch of his fingers. He reaches out and follows the delicate twisting and curling of the lines around his hand. It's half like he's following the movement with his eyes, half just the feeling of his Quirk shifting through his hands. He types in the phone's code, digit by digit. The phone unlocks. Izuku pokes around the apps for a while. There isn't much on it but the default apps. Not even any personal texts, just some group chats about setting up the robbery. Then Izuku realizes what it is. It's a crime phone. The man must have just used it as a burner for whatever shady stuff he was mixed in with. Why had Izuku grabbed it, though? Izuku feels a nudge from his Quirk. He needs to get something. It's fuzzy, something to do with the phone. Izuku pokes around and finds himself gravitating toward the App Store. Then his Quirk nudges him towards the Twitter icon. Izuku stops to stare at the phone, just to be contrary. Now his Quirk was just telling him to make social media. His Quirk sulkily pulls at Izuku's gut, and he gives up and downloads Twitter on the criminal's phone. He gets to the account setup page, then stops as he's about to set up an account. His Quirk wouldn't ask him to make it unless there was a good reason. If the account was supposed to be in Izuku's name, then it would just have him make the account on Izuku's phone. What for a handle though? Izuku ponders it for a bit, then decides on Foresight 2020, because why not? He makes the account using the phone number of the phone he stole, then opens the home page to browse through trending topics. Then his quirk sends him a nudge towards a certain account. Why? Izuku asks out loud. His quirk continues to nudge. Well, time to figure out how to get a friend request from the pro hero Hawks. Generally, his quirk doesn't ask much of him. It's just helpful, keeping him from most inconveniences or embarrassments. Most things it asks of him made sense within a day or two at most, and rarely were they totally crazy. But there are exceptions like the bank and like today. Izuku stands in front of the sketchiest building he's ever seen and internally curses his quirk. It's been a few months since the incident with the bank. He is now 12 years old. Nothing much had happened after that. He just occasionally read through the crime group chat and wondered what exactly the point had been. He's wearing heavy makeup which make him look older than he was and has a couple $1,000s in his pocket. This is incredibly sketchy. Izuku walks in anyway. What you want? Asks an older woman reading a magazine, her feet rested casually on the counter. Dunno. Izuku says completely honestly. What can you give me? There was a certain art he'd learned from having his quirk. It involved showing up to places and letting people come to their own conclusions about what it was he wanted. These days it went quite smoothly. The woman looks up at him from over her magazine, and then looks him up and down. What are you, 14? Izuku stares at her, not saying a thing. I think maybe we could pull off 17, but that ain't gonna let you buy drinks or nothing, you hear? Izuku stares, then decides that whatever she's talking about is probably alright. Let's do it, Izuku says. She raises her eyebrows and takes her feet off the counter. Just a card, or do you want something that'll stand up to a bit more looking into? She asks, typing something on her computer. Izuku considers the amount of money in his pocket. How about the works? Izuku asks. It was something he'd heard from a TV show recently and he thought it sounded good. An hour later, Izuku walks out with an incredibly convincing fake ID for one 17-year-old Akatani Mikumo. The whole thing had actually been quite a bit of fun. For a convincing trail, they'd had to come up with a whole backstory. After a bit of consideration, Izuku had settled on Mikumo Akatani being a quirkless orphan living in a fictional address in Aichi. It came with papers proving his birth and the death of his parents, along with a P.O. box connected to his name. After he walked out with the new ID, he's left with $60 left in his pocket. He uses 50 of them to buy a prepaid flip phone from a corner store. Then another 5 to buy bubble tea. He ends up needing to use the last 5 because his bus pass has expired. There is a general trend in his life, Izuku thinks as he intentionally rides the subway into an active villain fight, that he tends to go towards danger rather than away from it. He supposes that it does make a sort of sense. After all, generally, if you have the initiative, then your enemies will always be on the defensive. The problem being that Izuku has no idea who his enemies were. But his quirk does. Presumably. So once he's at the stop from where the ear-splitting shrieks of metal and insane ramblings are emanating, he steps out from the empty subway car. There isn't any immediate danger where he is, so he sets about finding it. He gets to the entrance of the subway and takes in the street. There was some sort of villain group trying to, from what Izuku can see, simply cause as much property damage as possible. At least 4 of them had already been apprehended. Heroes are zipping around, protecting buildings and civilians. One of them catches Izuku's eye. He's flying around in a cloud of red feathers, faster than Izuku can process. If Izuku isn't mistaken, that is pro-hero Hawks. So that's the guy Izuku is supposed to get to follow him on Twitter. Google said that he's one of the top young heroes to watch. Apparently he's been quickly climbing the ranks. Some said he might make it into the top 10 pro heroes within the year. And Izuku needs to be friends on Twitter with him. Why exactly is his life so weird? Who is he kidding? He loves it. His quirk isn't telling him to move, so he leans against one of the pillars and watches the show. The fight is winding down at that point. The villains are being put into quirk-suppressing cuffs and sent away. Izuku idly wonders what would happen if he was put into a pair of those. Would his quirk just stop? The thought is strange. He's never really been without his quirk's intuition. How well would he even function? Who knows? More than likely, his quirk will just never let him get into a position where it could be a problem. It's as he's considering this train of thought that the building he's in collapses. Well, that was a little dramatic. He's standing in the entrance to the subway, so it's more like the structure that he's standing in front of collapses. Thankfully, though he knows that it wasn't due to luck, none of the chunks of concrete hit him. So he is just left coughing in the wreckage. Dirty, but unharmed. Then something grabs him and shoots him into the air. Oh shit, mumbles the person that had grabbed him. Izuku looks up and into the eyes of none other than pro-hero Hawks. Izuku says, looking down at the ground, some 100 or so feet below. Hi. Shit. The hero says, then lands on a building. He starts patting Izuku like he can't believe he's in one piece. I thought that building was empty. Shit, are you okay? How are you okay? Izuku stares for a minute, trying to figure out what his quirk wants exactly. He glances back at the street. The fighting seems to have ended. Well, this is as good a chance as any. That was scary. He settles on saying. No shit. Hawk says, running his hands through his hair. No, sorry. I thought that building was empty. Kid, I'm sorry. How did you even get dash? There's something I want. Izuku interrupts. Hawk's head snaps toward Izuku, and he is reminded that this is a proper pro-hero. His eyes narrow slightly, and Izuku gets the sense that his wings have shifted into something more dangerous. Follow me on Twitter. Izuku almost shouts. He doesn't need to fake the nervousness. Hawk stares at him. Follow you. On Twitter. He repeats slowly. Yeah, that would make me feel so much better, and I dash. Hawks lets out a groan. You know what? Whatever. He pulls his phone out from his pouch, then pulls it to his face. He clicks some things, then looks back up at Izuku. Username? Foresight 2020. Izuku chirps. I'm already following you. Hawks clicks some things, then frowns and tucks away his phone. There, it's done. That make you feel better? Izuku grins and clasps his hands together in response. Hawks rubs his hand over his face and groans. I'm too young to not understand the kids these days. If it makes you feel any better, I don't understand me either. Izuku chirps. It does not, but thank you. Hawks takes his hands away from his face, looks down at the street. Are you ready to get down? You can catch people who are falling from buildings, right? Izuku asks, a fantastic idea forming in his mind. Yes? Hawks asks, turning to Izuku. Too late. Izuku is already jumping from the lip of the building. Hey, his quirk didn't tell him to stop, so might as well, right? Hawk's shout of surprise and utter confusion follows him down. The feathers do catch him though. Izuku should retroactively make a bucket list, just so he can scratch that off it. One day, not long after that, his quirk tells him to buy a certain phone charger, and when he gets home he finds that it perfectly fits the crime phone. He never charged that, did he? After a few minutes, his quirk calls him over and he picked it up and turned it on. Within moments, notifications began to pop up. Leader. Good evening, my fine friends. It has been long since our last conquest, but it seems time to once again try our luck in the endless game that is life. Vienna. Didn't almost all of us get arrested last time? Leader. A truer thing has never been said, my favored teammate. However, the time has come that we have once again achieved freedom. Thus, it has come time for a new venture. Slingshot. Would it cause you, like, physical pain? To not use an exclamation point? Leader. It would not. Paper cup. Leader. Did you break out of prison? I thought you were going to be another 2 months. Leader. No, I did not. I got out early on good behavior, because I kept giving other prisoners heartfelt and life-changing advice which led to positive habits and happier lifestyles. I did this for very nefarious reasons. Like fraud. Anyway, my new plan. That is the thing which we should talk about now. Slingshot. This? Paper cup. I think he's typing, give him a minute. He's told me that the phone is too small for his thumbs. Leader. The plan is simple, but in that simplicity is complexity. There is a building which has been destroyed in a villain attack. Before it is completely demolished, we shall go through it for any valuable items. The relevant paperwork will be filed within a few weeks. We shall be stealing from directly beneath the heroes' noses. Slingshot. Is that even illegal? If you, filed the paperwork to do it? Leader. Yes. Paper cup. You heard him, it's illegal, he would know. He's the criminal mastermind here. Leader. You flatter me. Continue. Paper cup. You have beautiful eyes. Leader. This has become too much and I must now leave. Slingshot. So, we're doing this? Izuku's Quirk pushes him to answer. Sparky. I'm in. When he's 13, Izuku stands in front of another building. This one is an incredibly expensive mansion. It looks like something celebrities would live in. With a fake ID in his pocket and newly bought gardening gloves, Izuku walks through the front door. There's a man with a mustache and two heads who opens the door as soon as Izuku knocks. Oh, you're here to apply? Yes. Izuku nods because that seems the thing to do. Thank you for coming. The man shakes Izuku's hand, then starts to give him a tour of the entryway and kitchen. My name is Konishi Kazuo, the man says. I'm the manager of the property. Mikumo Akitani, Izuku responds. For some reason Izuku's Quirk is pushing him to avoid the cameras, so he does. Eventually, Konishi takes Izuku to the backyard, then sighs. I'm sure you're wondering where the owners of the house are, yes? Izuku is not, but nods anyway. They are currently on a vacation. That's where you come in. Konishi nervously looks at Izuku. You see, the master of the house made me swear that everything on the list he gave would be completed by the time they get back. The man conspiratorially leans forward, grabbing Izuku by the shoulder. It's impossible. Konishi hisses. Really? Can I see the list? Izuku asks, wondering why he's here. Konishi shows Izuku a list, then shows him the lawn, the gardens, and the other gardens. Izuku starts to get it. Why don't you have another person to help you? Izuku asks. I did. I had a gardener that did all the landscaping. But she quit a few days ago. Konishi says miserably. Will you help me? Izuku stares at the huge lawn, with the expensive and complicated-looking garden. He's worked with plants before. He's got near a whole rainforest of houseplants in him and his mom's apartment. This seems like something a little bit bigger than that. Of course. Izuku promises, shaking Konishi's hand. He spends a few hours pretending to know stuff about having a real job, then leaves after settling on a frankly ridiculous hourly pay. He passes the front gate and remembers to check the nameplate. Todoroki household. Sometime later, the leader of the group sends out the time and place of his proposed meeting. Within a moment his quirk settles into his stomach, telling him to join them in the meeting. It leads him to get his makeup set and he begins the now familiar routine of making his face look older with contour. He pauses in the mirror. He looks a few years older, maybe 16 or 17. He dyed his hair black a few weeks ago and had used a bit of gel to style it away from his face. He smiles in a practiced way at his reflection. He looks clean-cut but harmless. He grabs a sturdy pair of shoes and leaves the apartment. He rides the bus to the address that the leader had texted. As he gets close, he sees the rubble that used to be a building. It had once been some office building, but now most of it had collapsed to the bottom floor. Out front of the building is a group of people casually chatting. As Izuku walks toward them, the tallest of the group waves enthusiastically. He has wild, pale hair and a wiry frame. The way he moves reminds Izuku of a hummingbird. Good morning, he shouts, though people are really not that far away from him. I hope you are prepared for a productive day of villainy. Someone beside him gives him a smack on the back of the head and another two glance around them in alarm. The woman who'd smacked the one Izuku assumes to be leader looks similar to him, enough that Izuku suspects they're related. Why would you do that to me? Leader whines. Because. The one who'd smacked him says with particular emphasis. We are not doing anything illegal. She coughs and glances around. We are a legal salvage party who will not be getting in trouble with the authorities today. But, Seiko, the leader says slowly. It is actually legal. I just kept saying it was illegal so more people would come help. Seiko makes a strangled noise and throws up her hands. You've been insisting on this crime thing for weeks. You kept trying to convince me that it really was a crime. And you came to help. The leader answers cheerily. Seiko turns and walks away. All right, the leader says after a few moments of silence. Time for introductions. A few people glance around at each other. One man, tired-looking, with an air of easygoing amusement, raises his hand. Just you. The leader shouts happily. I don't think giving one another our real names would be wise. He says evenly. Perhaps we should exclusively use nicknames? Oh, code names? The leader says, fascinated. I love it. I am leader with 3 exclamation points. Are we using the names from the group chat? The tired man says, looking a little stricken. Of course, anything else could be confusing. Leader says. Oh. The tired man spends a few moments seeming to muster strength. My name is Paper Cup then. There are a few muffled coughs around the circle. Leader eyes Paper Cup with new interest. I'm Slingshot then. The woman who Leader had called Seiko said from just outside the circle. She had the same pale hair and tall frame as Leader. Introductions continue around the circle in a similar vein. Some members of the group find themselves with more reasonable names than others. I'm Sparky, Izuku says when it comes to his turn. There's a bit of a silence when attention lands on him. Leader and Slingshot send each other wary glances and anxiety rises in Izuku's gut. But nothing comes of it and introductions continue. Once introductions are done, Leader begins going through the safety procedures of salvaging. For this process, he actually slows down and listens to questions. After safety vests and hard hats have been passed around, the group disperses around the site to begin the salvaging. It continues on for some time, the group carefully pulling apart parts of the building and prying loose anything that seemed valuable. Izuku finds that the process is unexpectedly fun. It's careful work. Each area that they explore needs to be first cleared as safe, then meticulously searched through for valuables. But the group is in high spirits and Izuku finds himself joining in with the jokes and cheerful chatter as they start clearing new areas of the building. They often send him to look through the new areas first and the group give him praise or congratulations each time he finds something else interesting. After a few hours the safe parts of the building have all been cleared and the group decides to call it. They stack everything that has been salvaged into the truck which Leader has brought. The man himself runs to a nearby store and returns with drinks and snacks for the whole group. They sit together on the front steps of the building and enjoy the shade. The heat's grown intense during the hours they've spent working and it's a relief to sit and enjoy the rest. Izuku finds himself with a juice box and a box of crackers. To his left is the man who's resigned himself to being called Paper Cup. He's sipping a soda and lounging against the step. On the other side of him, Leader is excitedly telling the group about the friends who he'd made while fulfilling his community service hours. Apparently one of them had been a fan of the same TV series as him and they planned to visit some convention together. Izuku listens idly. Eventually members of the group begin to leave, each thanking Leader for his plan. Leader promises to contact them once he sells everything they've salvaged to pay them for the day. Once only a few members remain, Izuku decides that he should follow their lead and return home. Thanks for the plan, Leader, Izuku says, standing and stepping off of the steps. I really enjoyed today. It is none other than my duty as your leader. The man chirps, waving happily back at Izuku. If I ever find myself in need of minions again don't call them minions. Slingshot interrupts. Helping hands for my nefarious deeds, Leader continues. Then I will be sure to call for your aid. Thank you for your help, my friend. Of course, see you again sometime. Izuku smiles and waves as he continues on his way. He heads in the direction of the bus stop, but has only gone a block before his hands begin to shake and he stops to stare at them. His fingers shake, but the vines look worse. They're spasming across his fingers, growing and shifting in wild waves. Izuku feels a sense of nausea growing from his stomach, a deep sense of wrongness and a faint hiss of static in his ears. He winces and presses his hand against his eye, the hissing quickly growing louder. He manages a few more steps before it becomes too much and he leans against a wall. His heart begins pounding and he glances around. The feeling rises up even more and he takes an uneven breath. He watches the vines flicker across his hands. Then they completely stop. They're frozen on his skin, like a drawing or a black with the slightest sheen of green. They're frozen as they were, jagged and fractured across his fingers. Something is wrong. Very wrong. Something about his quirk has shifted. It's something like pain, but deeper. The comforting presence in his chest is gone for the first time. There's an empty place in the pit of his stomach and something like nausea is creeping into its place. He glances up and in front of him there's a man walking down the sidewalk. He has dark tinted glasses and one of those white and red canes in his hand. He doesn't seem to notice Izuku and he continues onward, but then he raises his own hand to his face like he's feeling something similar to Izuku. He stops, then seems unsure of what to do. He says, tapping around him with the cane. Hello? Is someone there? Izuku thinks the man is talking to him. Yes? Something's Izuku trails off, not sure what he should say. There's a new anxiety building in his chest. Something new and unsure that he's never felt before. Oh, the man reaches to his left and lightly touches a fence. You have some sort of future-seeing quirk then? Izuku jerks upright, mouth open. He leans backward again, mouth closing and opening. Yeah I do. He manages eventually. Why? He'd never said that to anyone before. He'd let that secret lie for almost a decade now. You're just a kid? The man asks, nodding his head like anything here made sense. Have you ever run into someone with a future-seeing quirk before? Izuku shakes his head dumbly. Then realized that the man is blind and that was stupid. No, I don't think so. Izuku manages. Well, this is your first feedback then. The man says. My quirk lets me see exactly 8 seconds into a future where I don't act. Izuku pauses, trying to figure out what this means. But the man continues. Say I'm walking down the street, he gestures around. My quirk tells me what the street will look like in 8 seconds if I don't take another step forward. Izuku doesn't quite get it. Whatever, the man waves his hand. You've got some quirk that lets you see into the future. When two quirks that see the future interact, you get feedback. Feedback? Like with audio, the two quirks will both be seeing and reacting to changes that the other quirk causes. This causes a loop. Eventually both quirk users can't see anything with their quirks. The man shrugs. What happens? Izuku asks, anxiety rising. Oh, nothing, just some temporary inconvenience. The man gestures at his glasses. Particularly for me, since I can only see things which happen in the future. If you're around for a while like me, these things can happen a lot. Izuku tightens his hands around his waist. Oh, he glances around. What do we do? Well, the man says. One of us needs to walk away until the feedback stops. It might last for a while, but it's not permanent. Oh, Izuku jumps to his feet. Yes, of course. Thank you for your help. Sorry for the inconvenience. He bows. He doesn't really know what he's supposed to do, but it feels better than nothing. No problem, take care out there. The man replies, still lightly holding the gate. Izuku returns the way he'd come at a fast pace, glancing behind him. Once he's a block away, Izuku sits down and stares at his hands. The vines are moving. Just barely. They're still splayed and awkward. Nothing like their normal graceful sprawling. But they are slowly moving across his skin. He can feel just the slightest pressure of his quirk in his chest. It's not quite comforting. It's not leading him like it always does. It's just there. Like it's sleeping or something. He looks back. The man has continued on his way. Izuku waves. After a pause that Izuku suspects is exactly 8 seconds, the man waves back, then turns a corner. Izuku can feel his quirk, but he still feels anxiety. It feels slow and disconnected, like it doesn't quite know what's going on yet. He sits down on a set of stairs and presses his face into his knees. He stays like that for a while. Hey, Sparky. Izuku jerks his head up. He blinks. The sun is beginning to set, but the sky is still bright. In front of him are Leader and Slingshot. Oh, Izuku says, feeling a bit slow. What's going on, kid? Slingshot asks. Her voice is flat but not unkind. Izuku feels something unfamiliar. Indecision. He doesn't know what he's supposed to do. He glances down at his hands. They give him nothing. He wants help though. He wants someone to understand and tell him what he should do. I had some trouble with my quirk, he says. He feels like he's stepping off a cliff. Your quirk? Leader asks. Yeah. Izuku pauses. Foresight? Foresight? Slingshot glances at him searchingly. I thought it was something with fire? Izuku shakes his head dumbly. He swallows. I lied. About my quirk. The words feel strange. Leader pauses. He seems like he's buzzing with energy, but doesn't know which direction to move with it. He sits down next to Izuku. Slingshot glances around, shrugs, and sits on Izuku's other side. Why did you lie? Leader asks, voice sounding understanding but a little hurt. It's not an easy quirk to explain, I guess. Izuku hugs his knees, looking down at the concrete in front of him. I don't tell most people. His quirk isn't guiding him for once. It's just settling around his hands, not telling him to talk, but not pushing him to stop. Just there, present but still. Well, would you try? Slingshot tries. It tells me things that I need. Or things I need to do. Izuku starts. Sometimes it's simple, like I always grab an umbrella when it's going to rain. Or I have an extra pencil when someone else needs to borrow one. Like my quirk knows everything I'll need. That sounds useful. Slingshot says her tone is reserved. Yeah, but sometimes the things that it asks me to do are they just don't make sense. Sometimes things that I do only make sense months into the future. For years I've just been doing these things because my quirk has never led me into trouble. Izuku pauses. He's never told anyone anything about his quirk before. You said you're having trouble with your quirk? Leader prompts. Izuku glances at him. Well, it's just that I've learned about something called feedback. I was walking down the street and I ran into someone who also had a quirk that let him see into the future and dash. Leader interrupts. Feedback? You know about it? Izuku asks. You know something? Slingshot asks at the same time. Leader waves his hands dismissively. Yeah. It was at school. This kid Tamaki-kin had this quirk where he knew what the weather would be, and there was this other kid who could tell which way a coin could land. Leader was gesturing wildly as he talked. One time I was talking to Tamaki-kin and the other kid walked by and they both flipped out. So we had a whole thing where we got the kid to try and tell how a coin would land. He couldn't do it and got really mad and started chasing Tamaki-kin. And I couldn't stand that, so I started chasing the kid. Then the teachers were called and I ended up getting detention, which is where I met this other kid called Dash. Slingshot interrupts him by flicking a pebble at his knee. We don't need your whole life story, she says. Oh yeah, right. So anyway, yeah, feedback, it's like a whole thing. Oh, Izuku says. I'd never heard about it. Wow, kid. Slingshot says with a whistle. That must have been a shock then. Glad that it didn't turn out too bad. Yeah. Izuku says. Something about the whole conversion has settled him. It was really, I've never had my quirk cut out before. It'll come back I think, but He shrugs, not sure what he wants to say. Leader stands then. Well, all's well that ends well. Glad to hear that you're feeling better. Slingshot sends him a look. You want a ride home, kid? She asks. She stands up and offers Izuku a hand up. He takes it. The offered ride is cramped. They are in the truck that Leader, or Izuku suspects, actually Slingshot, had rented to haul back the salvage they'd collected earlier today. Slingshot drives carefully through the cramped streets. Leader sits in the middle, filling the silence with his seemingly infinite number of stories. Most of them ended in him being in trouble with one authority figure or another. Izuku sits in the passenger seat, feeling light and relaxed in a way he hadn't before. He thinks it'll be all right. It takes the better part of a day for his quirk to be back to normal. The next afternoon, as he's watering his plants, he finally gets a clear impulse. His hands twitch away from the plant he's been watering and he holds his breath for a second. His quirk pushes him to store away the water spout and bring out a pair of clippers. He prunes a few new shoots off of his golden child ivy. Once that's done, he watches as his vines retract back into the pair of freckles on his wrists. They settle down, a deep and comforting feeling. The wave of relief is so strong that Izuku needs to sit down for a few minutes. There's a text from an unknown number. Izuku unlocks the phone and takes a closer look. A known number. Prospective job for you, 1 day of work, long time out, yes or no now. 10,000 yen before and 70,000 after. Izuku stares at the keyboard and wonders if he should respond. Then another notification dings on his screen. It's from the bank robbers group chat. Leader. Anyone else get this offer from those pretentious villain guys? Slingshot. Yeah. I don't understand them. Once EC they're all, you're not good enough to join our group, the next they're all, come take this shady deal for a suspicious amount of cash. Paulin. What are you guys talking about? Did I miss something good again? Why do you always leave me out of the interesting things? I don't get respect for the hard work that I put into making this group into a... Oh wait, the invite just came in. Leader. It's fine. Foxman. Sounds like a pretty good deal though? That much yen for a day of work? Pretty good, right? Slingshot. Unless you get arrested. Leader. Those guys are the worst. Izuku feels something hard to understand in his quirk. He stares at his hands. They twist and twirl across his knuckles and then creep outward. A few grow up and curl around his forearms. He's never been able to quite put the language of his quirk into words. Most simple things are just basic impulses. Those are easy to follow, easy to do. More complicated things means he needs to stare at the patterns of greenish-black vines that tumble across his skin. This pattern is somehow more forceful, a little more angular and intricate. Izuku reads it after a few moments. You want me to tell them to say no? Izuku asks out loud. Sometimes that's the easiest way to confirm he's understood correctly. The vines seem to curl in on themselves in glee. It feels like validation, but Izuku just snorts in amusement. Why couldn't his quirk just tell him to get simple things? This was getting ridiculous. Sparky, anyone else think there's something wrong with this? Leader. Well yeah, they are the worst. Sparky, I mean everything's kind of off. Why call all of us at once? Does that mean they're looking for disposable goons? Leader. Are you calling us goons? Slingshot. Sparky. Of course not. But I think these guys are setting us up as cannon fodder. I mean look at it. They send out mass text messages to everyone, even us who don't like them because they are the worst, with really high payments that we won't really get if we are thrown away by whatever they are planning to do. Leader. While that's a good point at Sparky, you are right, they are the worst. I vote for a boycott. Foxman, I vote we do get paid? I mean if we're doing a vote I can do that, right? Leader. Yes you can. However, I must warn you that I have 13 votes. Foxman, that means our votes don't matter though. Leader. Exactly. Foxman, I hate it here. Izuku watches the group chat as leader convinces the rest of them to join in on the boycott. At his quirk's instruction, he responds to the unknown number that he is willing to take the job. Izuku's first conversation with a Todoroki goes like this. He's working on the bushes outside the huge training gym, trimming and weeding and all the things required for the yard to look as high class as it does. Then his quirk tells him to bring his bulky gardener's duffel bag and go around to the front of the training room. He does and comes face to face with pro-hero Endeavor. He is standing in front of the doors of the gym, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. He isn't wearing his hero costume but he is wearing training gear. Izuku freezes but the hero doesn't react at all. He just gives Izuku a contemptuous look, seeing his grass-stained pants, gardener's uniform jacket, and duffel bag. Then he looks away from Izuku and fixes his eyes firmly on the back door of the house. Izuku, not exactly certain what he was supposed to do, bows slightly and keeps walking past the hero. Izuku walks across the yard and around the corner of the house. He almost runs into another boy. Izuku jerks backward and stops. The boy is standing under the eaves of the roof. He's peering around the corner of the house. Just like how Endeavor is staring at the back door. The boy has white and red hair, pale eyes, and a scar that covers half his face. This must be one of the Todoroki children then. The boy looks startled for a moment, then nods slightly. Izuku would have taken it for the boy being stuck up if Izuku didn't recognize the way the boy had no idea what to say. His quirk isn't telling him to keep going, so Izuku decides to stick around. What are you waiting for? Izuku asks in an undertone, sitting with his back against the house, out of view of Endeavor. The boy flinches and looks back at Izuku with wide eyes, probably hadn't realized that Izuku didn't leave. Aren't you working? He asks, though he seemed more confused than accusatory. Izuku shrugs. You want to fire me? If he says something bad enough his quirk will tell him to get out of there. The boy just blinks at Izuku, then leans against the wall so he can peer around the corner and still see Izuku. Usually the staff avoid us. I think NG will fire you if he sees you talking to me? He adds contemplatively, calling parents by their first name? Never a good sign. Meant Izuku doesn't feel bad butting in though. Huh. Izuku says, then on a hunch he adds. If that's what he wants, then you could just go out and tell him. Why would I do what he wants? The boy says. He seems to realize what he said a moment after he'd said it, and snuck a worried glance in the direction of Endeavor. Izuku lets the conversation slip into silence as he thought. Why had his quirk told him to come? Something to do with Endeavor standing guard in front of the training room. What are you waiting for? Izuku asks. The boy says nothing, just stares around the corner. Seems like you don't want to talk to your old man, Izuku muses, watching the boy for a reaction. But you want something from the building. The boy says nothing, but Izuku can see a layer of ice building up on his right side. Not training though, you're not dressed for it. He's wearing a long-sleeve dress shirt and jeans. But he is. So, my conclusion is that there's something in there you want, but if you go and try to get it, he's gonna rope you into training, no matter what you have to say about it. Izuku can see the boy's fist clenching and he glares at Izuku, though he still doesn't respond. There is a tugging sensation in Izuku's gut and he stands up, lugging his bulky duffel with him. As Izuku passes the boy, he tries to grab Izuku's sleeve and pull him back. Izuku catches a glimpse of the boy's face. It's rather desperate. He doesn't make a sound though, and soon Izuku is out of arm's reach. Izuku walks back to the training gym. Endeavor is still standing in front, but the hero ignores Izuku completely this time. Izuku walks right past him into the gym. Once inside, his quirk tells him to go to the far right corner. There is a bag laying under a bench that his quirk tells him to get. Izuku opens it partially. Inside are what look like school books. His quirk tells him to take it, so Izuku puts it inside his duffel bag and walks back out the door. Endeavor ignores him. Izuku walks across the lawn and back around the corner. The boy is staring at him, eyebrows furrowed and fists held tightly at his sides. Izuku sits down against the house again and pulls the backpack out from his duffel bag. He holds it out to the boy. The boy freezes, then takes it like it was some wondrous treasure. How'd you get past him? He asks like he hadn't just watched Izuku do it. He ignores Staff. I'm Staff. He ignores me. Izuku answers with a shrug. The boy holds his backpack at his front and sits down beside Izuku. He studies Izuku. You're a gardener? You don't look old enough. I'm in middle school. Izuku answers back with a shrug. Oh, the boy says, then leans back against the house, staring at his backpack. Well, I gotta head back to work, Izuku says, feeling like he's borne the awkwardness for long enough. He stands up with his bulky duffel. It was nice to meet you. Nice to meet you, the boy echoes softly, still staring at his backpack. The next Todoroki Izuku meets is actually pretty normal, though she does almost hit him with a glass jar. Izuku is outside the kitchen window, tending to flowers that didn't actually need to be tended until next week. But his quirk told him to, so Izuku is there, pruning and weeding. Then someone shouts from above him. He looks up to see a glass jar falling down from a high first-story window. His hands jerk upward instinctively and manage to catch it in his bulky gardening gloves before it lands on him. He looks up. A pale face peers out from the window and stares down at him. She has pale eyes and white hair with hints of red. She's older than Izuku, in her 20s or so. Oh my God! She shouts, leaning out the window and holding her hands to her mouth. There's someone there. Are you okay? I was just trying to make the windowsill pretty. I'm so sorry? It didn't hit you, right? It is a rather pretty jar, stained a lovely green-blue color. Real artsy, good decoration. I'm okay, Izuku calls. Your jar's okay too, want me to bring it up? No, I'll come down, wait a sec. She disappears from the window, and Izuku is left standing with a jar. A minute later, the woman exits one of the side doors and runs to Izuku. You're okay, right? Jess, checking him over. Yeah, it wasn't even going to hit me. Izuku lies, he holds it out to her and she takes it. You were putting it in the windowsill? Izuku asks, trying to change the subject. Yeah, she says, calming down. I was just trying to brighten up the place a bit. Just kind of fumbled with it. Scared me half to death when I saw that you were right under me, she says with an awkward laugh. No harm, no foul, Izuku says with a shrug. There's a second of silence. Then Izuku remembers that his quirk had told him to be here. What did it want him to do? Seems like it just wants him to meet all of the Todorokis. Well, it was mostly successful. There couldn't be that many more, right? So, you do the decorating here? You don't have staff to do it? Well, I guess I could get the staff to do it, she says with a sort of self-conscious shrug. But I thought I should do a bit, since I'm here anyway. No, that makes sense. I was just wondering. Izuku can feel his quirk pushing him to continue the conversation, and he internally flails for some conversation starter. That jar is nice. Were you planning on putting flowers or something in it? Huh, oh, well, I was thinking maybe river stones? She answers. She seems to grow a bit at the attention. I've been looking for ideas. I thought that maybe something like crystals instead. The light from the window would look nice with the jar's color. Once Izuku has gotten her into the subject, she warms up to talking. Izuku is quite content to ask the occasional encouraging question as she rambles about her various decoration ideas. She eventually brings him inside the main house and shows off some of the work she's done already. And during the tour the conversation drifts a bit. Izuku finds he really does enjoy her company. She was a bit bumbling and tended to interrupt herself, but she was kind and empathetic. Izuku finds himself mentioning his fashion club and the conversation wanders a bit. She tells him about her vague desire to get into more makeup and they commiserate in their twin struggles in finding a good foundation. After 15 minutes or so his quirk tugs at him to get out of the building and Izuku hears someone opening a door on the other side of the main house. Oh wow. Sorry, I've got to get back to work, Izuku says, standing up from the chair he'd settled in with an apologetic look. It was nice to talk to you though. I'll probably see you around? Yeah, it was nice, she answers with a smile. Sorry about, the jar thing. I'll see you around. My name is Todoroki Fuyumi. It's nice to meet you. I'm Akitani Mikumo. Izuku bows back at Fuyumi. It was nice to meet you too. Izuku flees from the house in a mostly orderly fashion. Izuku's quirk tells him to pull out a few $100s and pull on his coat. Seems like he's going shopping. The first store he visits is filled with things for computers. It starts with some kind of cable connector that seems to go from some older version of a USB to something that will work with his computer. But that's not as weird as the next thing his quirk guides him to. The writing on the box calls it a RFID cloner, and his quirk seems convinced that he needs it. The vines are particularly interested. They've grown across his hands and past his elbows. Izuku looks up what this thing is on his phone and finds that it's designed to copy ID cards. If you just scan the signals from ID cards with the thing, it can copy that signal and get through any scanner that reads that card. Izuku hadn't heard of it before, but it is interesting. He buys the cable and the RFID copier and finds that that takes up most of the few $100s that he'd brought with him. The next place that his quirk leads him to is a thrift store. He wanders through the shelves until he finds 3 old jumpsuits. They're some kind of maintenance uniform, with the logo of a museum that Izuku has never heard of. He also grabs 3 flashlights from the electronics section. The third place that Izuku goes is the most fun. It's a fireworks shop. He spends a while looking at things that look interesting. After a while spent having fun, his quirk guides him to something that looks like a smoke bomb with a timer on it. He reads through the instructions and finds that it's meant for fire show productions to make things more dramatic. He buys it. When he goes home, he starts altering the jumpsuits. Sewing is one of those things that his quirk makes a little bit weird. The actual act becomes an unusual but still fluid mix of his own judgment and experience and his quirk guiding his hands. The changes that he makes to the jumpsuits are pretty normal though. One of them he hems to fit himself. The others he doesn't change quite as much, just a bit thinner. He doesn't know who they're meant to fit, but he packs them away in his closet and figures that they'll come in handy sometime. When the time comes to apply to high schools, his quirk only tells him one. It's an expensive place, the kind generally only open to the richest of kids. Izuku stuffs down his nervousness and applies. Izuku got into the school. Not too surprising. He'd always been pretty okay at classes. The only really hard part was convincing Mom that he got a scholarship which paid for everything. Once that's done, he just uses the cash from his job and from the bank robbery to pay the whole year's tuition. It takes a good chunk out of what he has left, but his quirk seems to think it's worth it. The only part he doesn't like is that his quirk pushes him towards a tiny apartment near the school. He doesn't really want to move away from his mom. But, well, he was already pretty deep into this whole mess. It doesn't make much sense to chicken out now of all times. The apartment he ends up with is tiny. He doesn't have much in terms of belongings, but he brings more than a dozen of his plants with him. They make it feel like home more than anything else he's brought with him. But once his stuff is moved in, he finds that he really did like it, and realizes that just outside of the window is a ladder leading to the roof. He moves in a few days before school starts, then makes sure to call mom every few days. Izuku's quirk pulls him out of bed and he groans. It's Saturday. His first week of school had been exhausting and he'd been looking forward to having a break over the weekend. No such luck it seemed. He gets ready for the day. Then his quirk pulls him toward the storage boxes in the closet. He hadn't yet unpacked them, so they were still taped up. He opens the box and finds the items from his mysterious shopping trip a few weeks ago. His quirk tells him to pull out the jumpsuit and the flashlights. He puts the rest back. So that was still a mystery then. He packs all of them into his bag and heads out. Izuku's quirk pulls him across the city to a neighborhood he's never seen before. It doesn't look expensive, but it isn't quite dirty. He slips into an apartment building behind a group of people and takes the elevator to the 5th floor. He glances around, wondering what exactly he's doing here. But the vines on his hands lead him to one of the doors. Izuku is wondering if he should knock when his crime phone dings and he digs it out of his pocket. It's a message. Leader. Greetings, Sparky. I have another opportunity for you today. Would you be willing to work with our illustrious group once again? Izuku glances at the message, then at the door in front of him. His quirk pushes him toward the door. He knocks. After a bit, someone answers. It's the woman who's called Slingshot. She doesn't look like Izuku remembers. She's dressed in casual clothes and seems like anyone that Izuku could meet on the street in his day-to-day life. How the hell did you get here? Is her first question. Izuku wanders past her at the prompt from his quirk. Inside is a normal apartment. It doesn't look like something that a villain would live in. But there are pictures of both Leader and Slingshot and it seems comfortable enough. Seiko. Who's here? Yells Leader's voice from another room. Give me literally 1 second. She shouts back, then turns back to Izuku. But seriously, why are you here? I think that Leader has a job? Izuku tries. He literally texted you a minute ago. Slingshot says. Well, I told you I'm always in the right place, didn't I? Izuku answers. It seems like this is the place to be. That takes her a few seconds to parse. Your quirk? Yeah. Izuku nods. It told me to be here. Slingshot stares at him for a few moments, then laughs. Holy shit, kid, she says and ruffles Izuku's hair as she strides past him into another doorway. This might actually turn out well for once. Izuku wanders in behind her. The room looks like it could be a kitchen under the layers of paper and string that covers all available surfaces. Leader is standing in front of an impressive-looking board that reminds Izuku of conspiracy theorists. Leader glances back and does a double take at Izuku. Sparky, what? How nice of you to join us so fast. Then he pauses. Wait, how did you get here so fast? And how did you know where we live? Quirk, remember? Slingshot says. She settles into a dining room chair, waving a can of Coke. Oh. Leader's eyes are wide. That's... Izuku feels a thread of anxiety for a moment. Absolutely amazing. Leader crows. He jumps toward Izuku and puts his arms on his shoulders. I'll be honest, I thought you were exaggerating or something when you were telling us about it all before. But that's seriously amazing. And terrifying. You're not like the police or something, right? This is going to be so cool. Do you want to plan with us? I've got the most amazing plan so far. I've got this buddy who knows a guy who once worked at this museum and he says that there's an exhibit that has light security but has some pretty valuable things and oh, do you want something to drink? Izuku pauses for a second. Not sure if Leader is going to let him respond or just pile on more questions. I'm sure. Izuku manages. Great. Leader says. He gets drinks for himself and Izuku, then decides he's hungry and makes them all lunch as well. Izuku doesn't think he stops talking for the entire time. But he doesn't mind it too much. Leader is a bit abrasive perhaps. But Izuku has never minded listening to people. So, Slingshot eventually cuts in. Now that my brother has talked you deaf, let's get down to business. Oh yes, leader says, through a mouthful of sandwich. What is the plan? Izuku asks. Okay, so, Slingshot says, sorting through one of the endless piles of paper to pull something out. There's this museum of early Quirk-era stuff, right? Right? Asahi, leader does a little wave and Slingshot continues. Knows a guy who knows a guy because I'm pretty sure he knows everyone who worked there and left a few months back. Slingshot hands Izuku some papers. They have pictures of what look like old toys and some old type of phones that he doesn't recognize. These are some of the things that are kept there. It's basically just junk that people preserved from the early Quirk era. It's just there and not really that important to anyone. But there are some people that really like this stuff. So it's got a bit of a collector's market in various places. This means that this junk that no one really cares to protect is really expensive junk. Leader cuts in, he seems to have inhaled his sandwich in the last few moments. And that's why we're going to steal it. Oh, Izuku says. Leader stares at him for a few moments, then glances at Slingshot. Izuku doesn't quite know what passes between them. Of course. Slingshot says diplomatically. This is just something that we're cooking up. There's really no need for you to get caught up in it all if you're not looking for it. We'd love your help, but crime's not exactly for everyone and we'd understand if after that last close call if you'd not want to dash. Oh no, Izuku says. After all, his Quirk's got a plan, and Izuku doesn't really worry about morality or that kind of thing anymore. I'll join. What do you guys need? Really? Leader leans forward gleefully. Just like that? Yeah, what do you need? For your heist? Slingshot tilts her head at Izuku. The codes to get in. She pauses. And a more foolproof escape plan. My plan is already foolproof. Leader starts, but Slingshot shushes him. Izuku nods and reaches into his bag. He pulls out the jumpsuits which he'd grabbed. Leader pulls them towards him and looks at the badges sewn into the front. Wait, this is from the museum. How'd you dash? Leader and Slingshot look at each other. There's a bit of a gleam to their eyes. Izuku says, there's another thing actually, could I have your phone? Leader shrugs and hands it over. So, I've got this thing where I can, Izuku says slowly, then he follows the movement of the vines on his hands and types in the password to Leader's. Well, I can always know passwords. He hands it back. Slingshot laughs, long and hard, doubling over from the force of it. It's something between malicious and delighted. Kid. She finally manages, pulling herself upright and wiping at her eyes. You're a goddamn natural. This is going to be so good. They spend a while after that planning. Izuku's never really planned something before and is vaguely interested in learning what it's like for other people. Later, Izuku says his goodbyes after the details have finally been decided. Before Izuku can duck out, Leader makes them a second lunch and sends Izuku off with leftovers. After school starts, Izuku works less, but the times that he does work are now only the times where the children of the Todoroki family are home, so he soon runs into yet another Todoroki child. It starts with what has begun to be a bit of a routine for Izuku. He's working on the hydrangeas, which are actually rather difficult to work with, since they change color with the pH level and tend to be finicky. He's carefully adding limestone powder to the soil. The hydrangeas are meant to be a pink, almost red color, which the limestone allows, but just too much can lead to the flowers dying from the soil being too basic. He's rather focused on the task and is trying to coax his Quirk into helping him, when he's pulled out of his task by the feeling of his Quirk jerking him upward. He stumbles to his feet in time to see the Todoroki, the one with red and white hair, creep around a corner of the house. He sees Izuku and rushes toward him. They've settled into something like companionship. The kid seems to have picked up on Izuku never being caught doing something against the rules by Endeavor. He's taken to finding Izuku while he's working and sticking around. Izuku's honestly not sure what to make of it, but he doesn't mind the kid's company. Izuku smiles at him, then sits back down by his work bag. He pulls out a protein bar he'd grabbed that morning and hands it to the Todoroki wordlessly. He goes back to tending the soil. So hydrangeas, right? Right? The Todoroki replies. He starts on the bar. He's gotten used to Izuku giving him electrolyte drinks and snacks occasionally. They have this property where they change color based on the acidity of the soil. Izuku continues on this track for a while. The Todoroki doesn't seem to mind that Izuku is the only one talking. And Izuku doesn't mind talking about nothing for long periods of time. The Todoroki pulls out some school work from his bag and works on it as Izuku talks. After a while, Izuku runs out of small pruning and adjusting that he could justify on the plant and feels a pull on his quirk. He packs up his tools and hands the Todoroki the garbage bag of yard debris he'd collected. He takes it without complaint. Izuku heads toward the gardening shed and gestures for Todoroki to enter it. He does, trusting Izuku at this point. Just as the kid is out of view, Endeavor walks around the side of the house. He's got on training clothes and is obviously looking for his son. He glances at Izuku, then continues onward without a second look. Okay, Izuku said with a nod. The Todoroki pokes his head out, then glances at Izuku. You know that you might get fired for this? He asks hesitantly. I can stop if you're going to get in trouble. Yeah, but I don't get caught. Izuku answers with a shrug. He hasn't been caught doing something that he shouldn't do in years now. And most rules are just guidelines anyway. The Todoroki says nothing, which is the moment when Fuyumi Todoroki and a man Izuku doesn't know round the corner. The instant Fuyumi sees Izuku, she smiles and waves. She grabs the man by the arm and drags him over. Hi, Akatani. It's been a while. Izuku has been working at the Todoroki household for almost 2 years now. He's seen and talked to Fuyumi a number of times. She seemed to take a general liking to him. She was a teacher at a nearby elementary school. Yeah. How has the year been so far? Izuku asks. It's been great. I missed it over break. She looks up at Izuku's head. Oh, you've dyed your hair again. It looks great. Thank you. Izuku beams. He and his mom had worked together to dye it black again. He rather likes it. Oh right. Fuyumi pulled the man forward. You should meet Natsuo, he's my other brother. Natsuo looks vaguely confused but bows at Izuku. It's nice to meet you. Fuyumi has mentioned you before. There's another Todoroki? Izuku bounces forward. He shakes Natsuo's hand and smiles. It's nice to meet you. I'm Akatani Mikumo. Alright. You're a gardener? Yes. He glances at Izuku's face, frowning a little. Izuku hadn't been doing the makeup that made him looking older for months now, but no one had called him out on it quite yet. Yeah. I've been here for almost 2 years now. Really? Natsuo says. Usually they don't last that low dash. Fuyumi elbows him. Okay, come on, he says, pulling away. Everyone knows it. With Dad's personality, he punctuates this with finger quotes. No one really wants to stick around that long. I mean, I just tend to stay out of his way. Izuku says with a shrug. He does do that. The other Todoroki says from behind Izuku. Izuku jerks around to look at him. He'd forgotten that he was there. Shoto. Fuyumi says, I wanted to ask you if you would visit Mom with us. The Todoroki, whose name was apparently Shoto, goes cold. Literally, his ice grows up his right side. No. Right, that's fine. I guess. Fuyumi says, smile growing smaller. Izuku's quirk pulses. Does your mother not live here too? Izuku asks before he can chicken out. There's a moment of silence while each of the siblings glance at each other. Fuyumi starts. She's got some health issues. So she lives at the hospital. Izuku feels like he just opened a huge can of worms. Nothing to do but step in it. I'm sorry to hear that. But if you're going to visit her, do you want some flowers? He manages. I could, pick some out for her? Fuyumi smiles at that and Natsuo relaxes. That would be lovely. Thank you. Then she pauses, then seems to calculate something. Actually, you could bring them to her yourself. I don't know. Izuku suddenly feels unsure. I wouldn't want to intrude on her if she's in the hospital. No. Of course not. Fuyumi's eyes gleam and Izuku doesn't know what that means. She doesn't get many visitors and there's a lot of people who she would like to see. As she says it, she looks right at Shoto, who looks away. If you're sure then. Izuku says, I'm done with my work today. When were you thinking of going? Just as soon as you're done would be great. Fuyumi says happily. Izuku shrugs and starts loading his gardening things back into the shed. The Todoroki siblings follow Izuku as he wanders around the grounds collecting clippings. His quirk keeps sending him in random directions, which he suspects keeps them perfectly out of sight of wherever Endeavor is at the moment. He and Fuyumi chat about their lives, and Natsuo chimes in every once in a while. Shoto trails along behind them, shooting wary glances behind him. Eventually they go inside to get the Todoroki's coats and a bag to carry the flowers. At the front door Shoto hovers around, then seems to make a decision. "I'll go with you," he says, pulling on a pair of shoes. Fuyumi and Natsuo snap around to stare at him. Fuyumi looks triumphant. Natsuo just looks shocked. "Don't you have to do training with Dad?" Natsuo asks. "No," Shoto says simply, then continues with a self-satisfied expression. "I haven't gone to training for weeks now." "What? How?" Fuyumi asks. "How'd you get out of it? Is that why Dad's been so mad lately?" Shoto nods, then gestures to Izuku. "I've been following him around," he says. "Somehow Father can never find him. If I just stay with him, the old man never has a chance to corner me." Fuyumi looks surprised, but Natsuo just laughs. Then Natsuo jumps forward to grab Shoto in a headlock and attempts to ruffle Shoto's hair. It goes poorly and he ends up sprawled on the floor. "I knew it," he wheezes. "I knew that there was some rebellion in you somewhere." They go to the hospital together in Fuyumi's car. At the door to their mother's room, Shoto hesitates, but Fuyumi grabs his arm and pulls him in before he can escape. The visit actually turns out quite pleasant. Their mother, whose name is Todoroki Rei, is quiet and kind. She sheds a few tears when she first sees Shoto. Izuku feels distinctly uncomfortable, but Natsuo slings an arm over his shoulder and quietly confides that Shoto hasn't seen his mother for years. Eventually the tears subside and Izuku takes his chance to offer the flowers he'd picked. The Todoroki's mother thanks him kindly and arranges them in a vase near her bed. Then Fuyumi explains to her mother that Izuku was Shoto's friend, and that when she'd invited Izuku, Shoto had volunteered to go along with them. Their mother seems to realize that there's more to the story, but laughs. She has a quiet laugh, a bit sad, but still lovely. There's not enough seats for all of them, so the siblings sit on the bed while their mother takes one chair and Izuku takes the other. Izuku is content to sit there and listen while the Todorokis tell each other about their lives. His Quirk settles down contentedly while they talk, and Izuku is glad that he's been able to do at least this much. Finally, the day that Slingshot and Leader decided on for the heist arrives. When he's getting ready, he brings the jumpsuits, the flashlights, and the firework. Izuku considers the smoke bomb for a long time, then shrugs and tugs them into his bag. He meets them at their apartment and they pack away everything that they'll need. Each of them put on one of the jumpsuits Izuku had brought. They fit perfectly. Slingshot and Leader pack a few things that Izuku's Quirk doesn't push for, but he decides not to bring it up. They take the bus to the museum, then enter a nearby apartment building. They walk in like nothing is abnormal and climb the stairs. There's roof access and they sit on the roof for around an hour waiting for the right time. Leader is uncharacteristically silent and tense. And Slingshot keeps asking Izuku about his gear and insists on them talking through the plan to make sure they know what to do. Just before it's time to leave, Izuku pulls out his crime phone. He follows his Quirk's instructions and pulls up the contact information of Paper Cup from the group chat. Izuku pauses for a second, not sure what to write, then shrugs and starts typing. Sparky, "Hey, sorry to ask this, but could you help us out? I've got Leader and Slingshot here, could you give us a ride? No rush." He adds an address in the next message, then packs away his phone. Then the fun really begins. It's mostly dark by the time that their plan kicks in. They climb carefully across a short gap to the roof of the museum. Eventually they find a small trapdoor access point with a keypad. Izuku puts on his gloves and follows the pull of his Quirk to type in a 6-digit password. The lock clicks open. They climb down the ladder and find themselves in a large storage room of some kind. It's crowded with boxes and storage racks. There's a few cluttered desks but no signs of people. It's also completely dark. The three of them pull out the flashlights and look around. Izuku's Quirk pulls at him. He glances at Leader and Slingshot, who are pulling out those paper floor plans they'd brought and talking in whispers. Izuku steps toward one of the desks. On it are a number of documents, and what looks like some older-style memory stick. It's plugged into an old computer. Izuku's Quirk pulls at his gut, and he grabs the memory stick. It looks like something from the early Quirk era. He doesn't know why his Quirk wants it, but he doesn't know why his Quirk does most of what it does. He packs the memory stick into a pocket of his bag. He shines his light across the desk and a paper catches his eye. He looks closer and finds that it's a description of the memory stick. It says that it's an early Quirk-era relic. Apparently it was thought to contain information about some villain of those years, but that the encryption had never been cracked and it eventually had been sent to the museum since it hadn't been used in any investigation. Interesting? Maybe. Izuku doesn't know why his Quirk would want him to have information about this. Then his Quirk pulls him away from the desk and back to Leader and Slingshot. Leader is walking to the main door of the storage room, and Izuku grabs his arm to still him. His Quirk prompts him to pull Leader away from the door and into a nook between a number of storage boxes. Slingshot glances around and follows them. Then the door to the storage room opens. Izuku can feel Leader tense up beside him. But whoever walks in only shines a flashlight around the room for a few moments before closing the door again. Leader lets out an explosive sigh. "Thanks, Sparky," he says quietly. He still looks quite stressed though. Izuku pats his arm and gets up. His Quirk pulls at him and he pauses. He reaches into his bag and pulls out the smoke-making firework. "What?" Slingshot hisses. "Why did you bring that?" Izuku just shrugs at her and sets it up in the widest part of the cramped storage room. "Sparky," she says, grabbing his shoulder. "This isn't part of the plan." Izuku spends a few seconds staring at her, trying to think of what he should say. He knows that this is the right thing to do. "Come on, Seiko," Leader says, pulling her away. "He's just like this. You know? It hasn't hurt us yet." Izuku carefully takes out the timer contraption and connects it to the fuse of the firework. He turns it on and sees that he needs to set a specific time amount. Slingshot says, "You're always like this, you can't just trust everyone." "Come on," Leader says. "Has he let us down yet?" "Fine." Slingshot says. "Let's just finish this." Izuku's Quirk tells him, digit by digit, to type in 2332. He pauses, then at the exact moment his Quirk tells him, he presses the start button. He stands back up. "Okay, we're good," Izuku says with a nod. Slingshot and Leader share a look. Slingshot makes a confused motion of her hand and Leader just shrugs helplessly. Izuku just heads to the door and Slingshot and Leader follow him after a few more seconds of silence. Izuku carefully opens the door and sees the inside of the museum proper. Izuku's been to museums for field trips before, and it looks perfectly normal from what he can remember. They're in a huge hallway lined with various items that Izuku doesn't think are particularly interesting. There's not any glass cases or anything, just red ropes a few feet away from the exhibits themselves. But, Slingshot says she takes a careful look around, then steps around the ropes to start piling objects into her bag. She looks back at Izuku and Leader and jerks her head at them. "Come on guys. We really do not have all day." Izuku follows her lead, and steps over the rope to start shoving things into his bag. Nothing really seems that interesting. There's some old-looking phones, some figurines that he doesn't recognize, and just a bunch of old stuff. Izuku doesn't really know why people thought this stuff needed to be in a museum. They are old, but nothing's that interesting. His bag is mostly full when he gets a warning pull from his Quirk. He pauses from trying to fit a stuffed animal into his bag and glances around. On the other side of the hallway, Slingshot's bag is full and she's quietly urging Leader to hurry up. Izuku snaps his fingers, and they both glance at him. He steps over the ropes and makes a hurry-up gesture at them. Leader keeps stuffing things into his bag, but Slingshot grabs him by the arm and pulls him to Izuku. Slingshot steps over the red rope, but when Leader tries to follow, he trips over it. The rod which had held the rope up clatters to the ground. Then the rest of the rods around it follow suit, pulled by the red rope. The resulting clanging is almost deafening in the complete silence of the museum. Leader stares at the rods, then back up at Izuku. He makes a belated gesture to try to pick up the rod again. Izuku feels the tug of his Quirk and takes off running in a seemingly random direction. He hears footsteps behind them. He rounds a corner and comes to an abrupt stop in an alcove in the wall. Slingshot and Leader rush through the doorway behind him, and he grabs their arms to tug them in with him. A moment later, loud footsteps sound from the direction that they'd come. then shouting and the sounds of some sort of walkie-talkie system. Izuku pushes back into leader and slingshot, and a few seconds later a security guard comes into view to his right. He jogs through the hall, only a few feet in front of Izuku, then rushes down the hallway they just vacated. Izuku grabs Slingshot's arm in his right hand and leader's in his left, then takes off in the other direction. He takes them away from the hallway they'd come in from. He can hear Slingshot's quiet stream of curses on one side and leader's quiet stream of apologies on the other. Izuku keeps leading them through the museum, taking a strange route that he assumes keeps them away from any cameras. There's a few times that he catches sight of security guards, but they don't get quite as close as the first time. Eventually Izuku leads them to a wider hallway. He can see the entrance across a lobby with a number of columns. There are a bunch of security guys in the front. Way too many to sneak past. Okay. Leader says quietly, "Guys, I'm so sorry. I'll go out and lead them away." "Like hell you are." Slingshot hisses and grabs Leader's sleeve. "We'll figure something out, okay? You don't need to take the fall for something else?" "I'm going." "No," Leader says, shaking off Slingshot's hand. "I've already got a record. It's fine, it's just another thing." "That's not a good reason, you'll just get in more trouble." Slingshot says. "You always let yourself take the fall. Most of the time it's not even your own damn fault. I'm literally robbing a museum right now." Leader says almost petulantly. "Well, you wouldn't be if you could get an actual job." Slingshot hisses. "I tried," Leader says, waving an arm. "I really do, but then I just get in trouble for stuff and I'm back in the shit again. I never asked you to join me in this. But I decided to," Slingshot says. "And for once in your life, can you just let someone else take the fall, please?" Their voices are getting a little loud. Izuku steps between them, holding the straps of his backpack and kind of wishing they'd hash this out some other time. We need to leave soon?" Izuku interrupts hesitantly. Look kid, those guards there." Slingshot points. "We can't exactly just walk out of Dash. That's the moment the fire alarm goes off." So that's what the fireworks were for. The lights are flashing and the sound is bouncing off of the concrete floors. It's deafening. Izuku tugs his backpack into place and grabs Slingshot and Leader once again. He pulls them to the side of the hallway for a moment. This is not a drill. There is a fire in the building. "Please exit immediately." A loud announcement calls from the ceiling. Then the loud alarm sound continues. Izuku keeps Slingshot and Leader in place for a moment, then walks toward the front door, pulling Leader and Slingshot along with him. They near the group of security guards at the same time as what looks to be a legitimate maintenance worker. He pulls out his clearance card to show the security guards, but they only give it a glance before gesturing him out the door. Izuku nods and rushes out behind him. The security guards see their uniforms and just wave them past. Outside, there's already a cop car and Izuku can hear sirens in the distance. Izuku pulls Slingshot and Leader along behind him and crosses to the other side of the street. Once there, Slingshot tries to pull them away from the scene, but Izuku pulls back. Just then, a beat-up minivan pulls up beside them. The window rolls down and Izuku sees the worried-looking face of Paper Cup. He looks tired and seems to be dressed in pajamas. "Guys, are you okay? What's happening?" he asks, glancing at the cops in front of the museum. Izuku pushes Slingshot and Leader into the car, then sits in the passenger seat. "We're good," Izuku says, then pulls off his backpack. "We just stole a bunch of stuff though, so we should probably leave soon." Paper Cup glances at the bag, then at the museum, then grows much paler and starts the car. He pulls out of his spot and into traffic just as the cops are beginning to run across the street towards them. Paper Cup is gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles, so Izuku leans over and pats him on the arm. "Don't worry, I don't get caught," Izuku says placatingly. "We'll be fine." Then he glances up at an intersection in front of them. His quirk sends him an impulse. "You'll want to turn right at the next intersection though," Izuku adds. Paper Cup does so, and a cop passes them going the opposite direction. Izuku gives him a few more directions, then tells him to pull into a parking lot maybe a mile away from the museum. Izuku leans back into his seat and stretches. His muscles had grown tense. "Holy fuck," Slingshot says from the back seat. Izuku realized she and Leader had been silent for a long time. He glances back at them. They're both gripping their seatbelts in white-knuckle grips. Izuku decides he'll let the language slide. They seem a little rattled. Paper Cup hesitantly raises his hand. What just happened? What follows is a very loud and somewhat exaggerated account of the whole heist from Leader, with occasional input from Slingshot. Paper Cup seems both worried and fascinated by the whole story. He also sends Izuku a few wide-eyed glances when his part is explained. Eventually Izuku interrupts the conversation. Could you drop me off back at my house? Izuku asks hesitantly. What? Oh yeah. Paper Cup says, attention torn away from Leader loudly explaining what it was exactly that they'd stolen. No problem, kid. The drive is 20 minutes or so. Izuku gives Paper Cup directions to his new apartment. During the drive, Izuku slips the memory stick he'd grabbed from the storage room into his pocket, then removes his crime phone from the bag. Once they're parked outside Izuku's apartment, he hands over the bag of things he'd stolen to Leader. Opens it and takes a cursory look inside. It'll take me a bit, but I'll start selling these off. Leader says. Don't do it too quickly or all at the same place. They'll connect it to the robbery. Slingshot says almost reflexively. I know. Leader says with a dismissive hand gesture. It'll probably be a couple of months. You good with that, Sparky? Izuku's caught a little flat-footed by the attention. He'd honestly forgotten about the whole getting paid part of this. That's fine, Izuku says. Actually, could I give half my share to Paper Cup? He helped a lot. Izuku felt a little bad about pulling the guy out of whatever he'd been doing. He was pretty sure that nothing bad could come of it, but this was the sort of thing people found stressful. I couldn't take your part, Paper Cup says, rubbing at the back of his head. I didn't do that much. 1/7. Slingshot cuts in, you get 1/7. Each of us gets 2/7. Simple enough, we're not just going to not pay you for this, dude. Oh, Paper Cup looks like he doesn't know what he should be doing. But he seems pleased enough. Thank you? Of course. Leader leans forward and pats Paper Cup on the shoulder, which makes the man even more flustered. As one of my minions, you'll be properly compensated for any business. Paper Cup seems pleased by this. Izuku says his goodbyes and Leader promises to be in touch. Izuku hops out of the car and walks into his apartment, sending the minivan a final wave. He walks up the stairs and into his apartment. Once he's back inside, he lays down face down on his bed for a while. His Quirk pokes and prods at him to get up, but he ignores it until it becomes too annoying. He scrapes himself off the bed and into his chair. His hands twitch toward the memory stick and he pulls it out. He turns it in his hands for a few moments. He watches the vines in his fingers twirl around the thing. It looks like triumph. He guesses this is the real reason for this entire venture. He digs around in his closet and pulls out that old cable thing he'd picked up before the museum and plugs it into his computer. Then he plugs the memory stick to that. His fingers twitch around his keyboard and he follows their lead. They lead him to the files inside the memory stick. When he tries to open it, he finds that there's a long encryption password needed to open the file. He carefully watches the vines, then starts typing. The password is more than 24 characters long. Izuku doesn't really know much about encryptions, but he thinks that this is probably the reason that the museum was never able to access the files inside the memory stick. Once the files finally are open, Izuku begins to explore. He doesn't know what he expected, but it wasn't this. As he gets into the files, he grabs a juice from his tiny fridge and curls up on his bed to read. It takes some time for him to understand the story being told. Most of the files are old news articles, some villain attack reports, and a number of simple text files that seem to be someone's notes on other sources. It looks like someone was compiling these stories for some purpose, and it takes Izuku a while to figure out what it was. It's not organized well, and some of the files are corrupted from the years. Izuku thinks that this might be upwards of 100 years old, so he's more surprised that everything is in as good a shape as it is. The story that Izuku pieces together goes like this. There was a villain very early in the development of quirks. So early that the quirk prejudice was still in full effect. He had a powerful quirk. Some said that he could copy other people's quirks. Other people went so far as to say that he could completely take away and give quirks. He was one of the most feared villains of his time, and that he caused more damage in those years that he was active than any modern villain Izuku could think of. Eventually his control waned and he fell back into obscurity. Or at least that's what the news articles said. The notes left by whoever created this said otherwise. They said that this person who they called All For One was still in play. The person referred to their own quirk as One For All, which Izuku doesn't know what to make of at first. As he keeps reading, he starts to think that One For All might instead be some type of title. That this person was part of some group of people who'd been working against All For One for some time. From what Izuku reads, this villain didn't lose power, so much as decide that he no longer needed to be the focus. His power never lessened, but anyone who knew what he was or what he could do was taken out of play so that he could do what he wanted unopposed. By the time Izuku schemes through most of the files, doing what he can to organize them by type and timeline, it's getting late. The clock reads 1:42 and his eyes are getting heavy. He transfers the files to his own computer, and at a twitch from his quirk, adds his own set of encryption passwords to them. That wasn't something he had known that his computer could do, but his quirk showed him how. He ejects and takes out the memory card. He drops it into a drawer with the adapter. Then he turns out the lights and settles back into his bed. This is something interesting. And he has a feeling that he'll go through the files again, more carefully next time. But why had his quirk done so much to get these files? It wasn't like this villain was still in power. The files were from over a century ago. The villain was long dead, and likely didn't have any power anymore. Izuku feels the creep of his quirk around his hands. He pulls them from under the covers and stares at them. The vines are thick and tangled around his hands, knotted and snarled around his fingers. He pulls out his arm and sees that they've climbed and are brushing past his shoulders. That's the furthest that Izuku has ever seen them grow. Which means that this is something important, and that Izuku really needs to do something. That this file is important. That this villain is still alive. The realization brings the vines to life. They shift and curl in what Izuku knows is acknowledgement. And what Izuku can read as determination and a plan. His quirk wants him to take down this villain. All For One. Whoever he is. Once he knows this, his quirk starts to curl into itself. It pulls back, curling until it recedes back into the twin freckles on the backs of his wrists. His chest radiates satisfaction. Izuku spends a long time laying in bed, staring at the ceiling and thinking about this villain. About the person who'd been working against him. He thinks about how this was the most information his quirk has ever given him about what a plan will be. He falls asleep thinking about the sheer number of heroes who've died to this villain over the decades. Izuku stands outside the Todoroki compound and looks at the notification on his phone. Something like regret settles into his stomach, along with frustration and anger, and annoyance at his quirk. The notification is that his contract with the Todoroki family is ending. His quirk is telling him to let it expire. He wants to stay working there. He likes working with plants. And he likes the Todoroki family. They're nice and they seem to like him too. Well, not Endeavor. But Izuku has never actually talked to the guy. Izuku smiles tightly at his phone and sighs. He knows that his quirk is right. And he knows that whatever his quirk is planning, it's big. Bigger than he can guess it yet. He slips his phone into his pocket and pulls on his gloves. He sighs a final time and walks into the Todoroki compound. The grounds are quiet as they always are. Izuku walks until he finds the gardening shed. Inside is Konishi Kazuo, the man with the mustache and two heads. He's organizing some bags of fertilizer. Izuku knocks on the open door of the shed. Konishi looks up at him. "Oh, Akatani," he says, straightening up. "Good timing as always. It's good to see you. Have you thought about my offer?" I did," Izuku says, rubbing his neck. "It's really kind of you, but I don't think I can accept it. I really have enjoyed working here. But I've got other things moving forward and don't think I can continue here." Konishi looks disappointed. "Really? This is quite the position." He starts. "And you've been a huge help here. I really don't know what it is, but you've really got a touch with the grounds. I don't think it's ever looked so good. We really could use you here. You've been one of the best gardeners we've had." "Ah, that's really kind of you," Izuku says, glancing away. "But it's not really in the cards for me. I really do appreciate everything that you've done for me over the years." Of course, kid. Konishi says with a sigh. I won't try and pressure you. I wish you the best of luck. I'm sure you'll be great in whatever you choose. You can grab your things whenever you like. Thank you. Izuku says, smiling. I would like to work one more day though. It would be nice to at least go through the motions one more time. Course you can. Konishi shakes Izuku's hand. I've got to head out, but I'm sure you know what needs to be done. Best of luck, kid. Thank you. Izuku says. He waves as Konishi leaves. There's still a sort of sad feeling rolling around in his gut, but he pushes it down. He grabs his gloves and whatever gear his quirk tells him to, then heads out. It's all standard. Trimming bushes and weeding the flowers lining the house. He's been there maybe 20 minutes when he sees Shoto walking up to him. He doesn't speak, just sits down next to Izuku. He's in his school uniform. Hey, Izuku says. He's trimming rose bushes. There's something I wanted to tell you. Shoto looks up at Izuku. His face is mostly blank, but he does look a bit tired. Izuku looks away from him, staring fixedly at the rose bushes. My contract here is ending. Izuku starts. I can extend it. Shoto says instantly. Izuku can see him sit up out of the corner of his eye. I know. Konishi offered to do that. Izuku says. He sets down the trimmer and sits down on his heels. But I've got. Well, other things are coming up. And this seemed like a good time to dash. Izuku shrugs. Oh, Shoto says. He's not looking at Izuku. I really did like working here. I've liked hanging out with you. And your sister and brother, and I liked meeting your mom too. Your dad I don't like so much, but that's not too much of an issue. Izuku sees Shoto's mouth twitching at the corner. I'm glad that I worked here anyway. I haven't seen your sister today, but could you tell her I said goodbye? Yeah, I'll do that. Shoto doesn't seem to know what to say. Yeah. Izuku shrugs and looks down at his hands. But, who knows, maybe we'll see each other sometime. Yeah. Maybe. Shoto echoes. He doesn't sound convinced. Hey, it's not that unlikely. Izuku says, feeling a slight smile on his face. Things like that just happen sometimes, okay? Shoto smiles. If you say so. He lays down on the grass, arms pillowed under his head. Izuku goes back to trimming the roses. After a few minutes, Shoto starts talking, which is unusual for him. Normally he wouldn't be the one to start conversations. But he just talks. About his hero training school. About his classmates and teachers. Shoto's a little awkward, like he's not used to talking so much. But he can be funny sometimes in a quiet, dry way. Izuku laughs a few times at the way that he describes his class's hero training exercises, and is interested to learn that one of Shoto's teachers is actually All Might himself. During Shoto's stories, Izuku picks up his tools and gestures for Shoto to follow him, and they loiter around a couple trees in the corner of the property as Endeavor walks past. Izuku waves at him, but the hero doesn't see him. Eventually, there's nothing left to do, and Izuku returns to the shed. Shoto tells Izuku about his recent visits to his mother and the time he's been spending with his siblings. Izuku starts packing up his things. He's accumulated a bit. A few pairs of gardening gloves, an extra water bottle. Odds and ends that had been easier to store at the Todoroki compound rather than carry with him. He packs them into his bag and walks to the back gate of the compound. Well, Izuku says, still a little bit sad. It's been a good one, yeah? Yeah. Shoto smiles then, just a small one. It's been a good one. Before I go I just wanted to say, and I don't want to overstep, but dash. Yeah. Shoto interrupts him. Well, I'm just glad that you've reconnected with your family, I guess. Izuku says. They're good people. And I guess I don't know the whole story, but I'm glad that you've got them. Shoto's smile grows a bit. Yeah, I'm glad too. He says, it was good knowing you. Yeah. It's not so final though. Izuku smiles. I'm sure that I'll see you, sometime. Yeah. Shoto says, sometime. Izuku walks out the gate with one final wave. Izuku's crime phone buzzes again. He checks the notification. A known number. The prospective job will happen in 2 days. Meet at 7 a.m. An address follows. Izuku stares down at his phone. So this is really happening then. He's going to work for real, actual villains. And he needs to be somewhere at 7 in the morning. But he sighs. His quirk has a number of things which it wants him to do. He replies an affirmative to the text number. He grabs his bag, a large chunk of cash from what's left of his crime money, and his jacket. He heads out the door. He goes out and buys a very heavy hammer, a thick black bag, a pair of walkie-talkies, and a golden mask that covers his whole face. Then he impulsively picks up a box of red hair dye and bleach. It's time for a change anyway. The morning of the attack, his quirk wakes him up at 5 in the morning. He groans and pulls his pillow over his head. But his hands tug him up and out of bed, and he finally relents and pulls himself up. He packs 2 bags. One of them contains his school uniform and books. The other is the bag he's just bought, the heavy hammer, his crime phone, and the flip phone he'd bought years ago when he created his false identity. He gets ready by pulling his hair, which he has dyed a dark red, into a messy knot at the back of his head. He then pulls on a black cloth mask and puts in red. Context. His hand hovers over the golden mask he'd bought, but his quirk pushes his hand away. He looks odd but not particularly notable. Not when compared with most people with mutation quirks anyway. At 6 in the morning he brings his school bag and uniform and hides it in a bush near his school. Then he starts toward the address which the unknown number had sent him. It's a shady-looking warehouse in the middle of an industrial district. He slips through a side door 2 minutes before 7 and is greeted with what seems to be hundreds of low-level villains. They have mostly mutation quirks and tend toward dark clothing. There's some amount of posturing and arguing, and Izuku pulls himself toward the edge of the crowd where he can lean against a pillar and try to look inconspicuous. Then he waits 20 minutes, during which the villains grumble amongst themselves. Then an inky blackness appears in the center. The villains who were arguing scatter and a number of them pull out weapons. Then the ink settles into the shape of a man wearing a suit. At his side is a slouching man who seems to be covered in hands. So these are the NPCs, the hand man says, glancing around him like he doesn't care much at all about them. The inky man seems to wait for him to say more, then steps forward himself when the hand man says nothing. "I am Kurogyri and this is Shigaraki Tamura," he says. "We've acquired your services today to serve as troops for an attack. We will be launching an offensive on the UA students. They are leaving the school to visit a training facility known as the USJ, where they will be vulnerable." There's a strange stirring among the villains. Some perk up with interest and take steps forward. Your job will be dealing with the students and the teacher of the 1A class. You will not attack one another and you use any force necessary against the heroes. Is that understood? No one responds, but every eye in the warehouse is on the smoke man. "Don't be so glum," said Shigaraki, his face set in a wide, flaky smile. "We're going to do something great today. We're going to kill All Might." There's a wave of movement across the room. The attack will commence in 30 minutes. Prepare yourselves. Then the two of them melt back into the void. Izuku shrinks back into the shadows as the villains break out into excited whispers. He feels his quirk pull him towards his crime phone. Izuku opens it and is drawn toward the Twitter app. He follows the movement of his quirk and types in a post. Foresight 2020, 7:34 a.m. At Hawks.Hero there is about to be an attack on the UA 1A class. Probably within the next hour or so. Good luck. Izuku posts it. So is this the whole point of getting Hawks at a friend on Twitter? Probably. Within a few minutes he starts getting messages from random people asking what he meant. None from Hawks yet though. He puts the phone on silent. He wastes a few more minutes doing nothing. Then more than 20 minutes later gets the impulse to take out his flip phone. He slowly types in a number, guided carefully to each digit. Then he dials. A few rings in, someone answers. "This is Hawks." "Who is this?" "Oh, it is? Well, you should probably check your Twitter. It seems kind of important anyway." "What? Why do you even have this number? It's Dash." Izuku hangs up. Just moments after that the smoke appears in the center of the room again. "We will be deploying in 1 minute." The voice of the smoke says. His voice seems to emanate from the entire cloud. Izuku surges forward with the rest of the crowd, narrowly avoiding a few elbows to the stomach. Then the world drops out from underneath Izuku, and he lands on unfamiliar dirt. He looks around. He's in some huge domed building. Izuku guesses this is the USJ. He's in some sort of plaza, surrounded by a huge crowd of villains. In front of them is a group which he doesn't know. They're dressed in bright colors and all look rather short. Those are the hero students. Izuku isn't close enough to see them clearly. In front of them is a hero Izuku doesn't recognize. He's wearing all black casual clothes, has bandages wrapped around his neck, and has on a pair of strange yellow goggles. Izuku hears whispers of the name Eraserhead from the villains. Apparently this hero is known in the world of criminals. Then the fighting starts. The villains around him surge forward against Eraserhead. Izuku runs the other way. By the time he's reached the edge of some thick vegetation, the hero has already taken out a dozen of the villains. Izuku keeps running. He passes through what seems to be an abandoned town, around a scenic pond, and then into a frozen wasteland. It looks like it's meant to be a street in some small town, but everything has been covered with an uneven layer of ice. He's going to keep running when he sees movement to his right. He whips his head around and sees a familiar head of white and red hair. Todoroki Shoto. This must be that hero school that he's going to then. Funny that Shoto had never said he was going to UA. Or he had and Izuku had just forgotten. Neither was possible. He raises his hand toward Izuku, then pauses, his eyes widen and his hand lowers slightly. Izuku waves at him, they're at least 20 meters apart. Oh, hi Shoto. I told you we'd run into each other. Izuku shouts. Then remembers that he's being a villain right now. Though I do need to leave now, nice to see you. Then he starts running away again. His quirk warns him just a split second before a giant iceberg bursts through the space he'd been moments before. He has enough time to duck into a building, then scramble through it and out a small back door. He sprints through a brief empty space and into another forest. His chest hurts from running and he thinks that maybe he's a bit out of shape. As he's running through the forest, he hears the sound of cracking from behind him. He glances around and sees the entire house has been covered in ice. Scary Quirk. Izuku changes direction and finally reaches the side of the USJ. There's a small door in the wall. It's subtle and painted to blend in. He pulls the hammer from his bag and smashes at the handle until the door finally opens. He rushes out and into a maze of corridors. Izuku guesses this is the maintenance entrance to get into the USJ. He catches sight of an exit sign and runs towards it. He finally gets out of the building and wastes a minute hunched over with his hands on his knees. He feels sick. He hasn't ran that long or fast in a long time. Then his quirk starts insistently pulling at his hands. Yeah. I know. He grunts and pulls out a flip phone from his pocket. Once again he goes through the process of slowly typing out a phone number digit by digit. It rings once, then someone picks up. Hello. This is Principal Nedzu. Who is this? The voice is strange and high-pitched but the dictation is perfect. Well, Izuku flounders for a moment, then realizes. Principal of UA? Yes. Who is this? You know your students that are, like, on a field trip or something? Izuku manages, he's still a bit out of breath. Well, there's a bunch of villains attacking them. I thought you should probably know. There's a short silence. Hurry maybe? There are a lot of villains. There's only 2 teachers and they've separated the students. The heroes have been notified. That was quick. Who are you? Izuku's quirk doesn't tell him to hang up yet and he flounders. I'm, Foresight. Yeah. Why do you have this? Information? Izuku's quirk finally lets go of the pole and Izuku instantly snaps the flip phone shut. He does not like phone calls. He pulls the back out of the phone and takes out the battery. He packs the pieces into his bag. Then he glances around and starts walking away from the building. He's maybe a block away when he hears something and looks behind him. There's a streak of gold that can be no one other than All Might, and just behind a streak of red that he's pretty sure is Pro-Hero Hawks. Izuku's shoulders loosen. Everything should be okay then. He heads to school. He finds the uniform he's packed away and changes in a public bathroom. He packs the bag of his villain stuff in a bush that his quirk indicates. Finally, he makes his way into the school. He walks in just as the receptionist at the front door is loudly copying some documents and files into his classroom, delicately avoiding the security cameras without conscious thought. He gets back to school only 2 periods late, but just the right comment convinces his teacher that he's been in school all day. He's officially marked as present and his alibi becomes flawless. Okay, that was pretty stressful. But it was fun. Izuku is trying to do homework when his quirk tugs at his gut. He spends a moment staring at his math, which is due tomorrow first period. Then decides that he absolutely does not care about it. He grabs both the papers and his textbook and shoves them into a drawer. His quirk tells him to put on the golden mask he'd bought. He pulls a hoodie over his hair. When he looks in the mirror, he can't see any of his face. He grabs the heavy black bag he's grabbed and puts in his crime phone and the walkie-talkies that he'd bought before the attack. He pulls on a pair of heavy gloves. Then he climbs out through his apartment window and up the ladder to the roof. It's quiet up there, and Izuku snaps a few pictures with his crime phone. Izuku then jumps across a few rooftops until he reaches a building covered in large scraps of fabric on wooden frames. He sits near the edge of the building for a few minutes, until Izuku sees a dark shape jumping across buildings on the other side of the street. His quirk pushes him upright and he grabs one of the walkie-talkies from the bag. "Yo!" Izuku shouts across the large gap between the buildings. The figure freezes and turns toward him. Izuku waves. The figure stares at him. "I've got something for you," Izuku shouts, then pauses. "Not in a bad way. Literally, I am about to throw you something." Izuku winds up and launches the walkie-talkie as far as he can get it. It doesn't go especially well. The walkie-talkie would have hit the side of the other building and landed on the street if the figure hadn't caught it with a long, pale tendril of fabric. Izuku realizes that this is the hero that protected the students during the attack. Eraserhead. The hero lifts the walkie-talkie up and stares at it for a few moments. Then takes it in his hand and holds it in front of him. Izuku grabs his own walkie-talkie and presses the button. It makes a loud sound. Then the figure moves a bit and the walkie-talkie makes another loud sound back at him. Izuku walks away from the edge of the building to sit near the center of the rooftop. The scraps of fabric move erratically in the wind, blocking the line of sight between himself and the hero. He presses down on the transmit button. He settles into a more comfortable position and pulls the mask up until it's out of the way of his face. "So, Eraserhead, right? Good to see that you're all right. How'd things go at the USJ?" Izuku starts. "Who is this?" Eraserhead asks. "Did no one introduce me?" Izuku says, crossing his legs. "I sent Hawks that message about that attack the other day." "That was you?" Eraserhead responds. "Yep." Izuku says with a pop. "Who are you?" "Foresight. Well anyway, I just wanted to catch up with you and make sure that everything went all right." "Why do you want to know?" "Well, I did warn you guys, thought I should know how things went, seems fair, right?" Eraserhead ignores him. "Were you also the other caller?" "Oh yeah, I called the principal after I got out of the facility." "Why?" Izuku thinks about that for a while. "I guess it was better to have multiple people aware of it so heroes would mobilize faster." "I see. Why did you warn us at all?" "Listen, Eraser. Can I call you Eraser?" "No." "Okay, listen, Mr. Head. You keep asking me questions but haven't answered any of mine." Izuku can practically hear the icy stare through the walkie-talkie. "Okay, so, what happened at the USJ?" Eraserhead pauses for a few moments. Only a few minutes after the fight had begun, All Might and Hawks broke into the US. They saved the students, along with myself and Pro Hero 13 from serious harm. When the villains found that their plan had failed so quickly, they retreated using the warp quirk. "Did they say anything?" "What do you mean?" "About what they wanted. Because if they didn't, then I've got some information you might appreciate." "What are your terms?" Izuku pauses. "What does he want?" "He'll probably tell the hero everything anyway. Is there anything that they could give him that he would want?" Izuku honestly can't think of anything. If he wanted something he could get it. There isn't really anything that the combined force of the police and the pro heroes could give him. That's for the both of us to figure out. There's a moment of silence, then Izuku thinks of something. "Oh yeah, by the way, I would prefer if you didn't try to catch me, it'll be inconvenient. And anyway, it won't work if you do try. I never get caught." Izuku pauses. His quirk seems sated, twirling contentedly around his knuckles. "Yeah, I think that's it. You don't want anything," Eraserhead says flatly. Izuku thinks that might be the only way he says things. "Yep, go ahead with your questions now." "Why did you warn the heroes?" "Well, I don't want those villains to kill anyone, duh. Who would just sit there and let them attack the students?" "So you were working for them and had a change of heart?" "No, course not. I just had some information and thought that I should share it with you. So you just show up out of nowhere and want to help us? Hey, I didn't just show up out of nowhere. I've done other things. There's a long silence. Izuku senses judgment there. I did a whole heist thing. I stole a bunch of stuff from a museum one time. You stole things? From a museum? And that should make us trust you? It wasn't important stuff. It was like early Quirk era collectibles. No one got hurt. Izuku decides that he's dug himself deep enough a hole and should probably put down the shovel. Anyway, that doesn't matter now. I know you've got questions about why the villains attacked you. I've got information. Izuku pauses. You're recording this, right? There's a short pause. Yes. Okay, good. So their leader's Shigaraki Tamura and the smoke guy is Kurojairi. Their goal, or at least the goal that Shigaraki said, is that they want to kill All Might. That's all that I know so far. So far? Yeah, I figure I'll learn more over time. You're still in contact with them? Nope, not yet. We'll see how things go though. You are not giving as much information as you think. No, I'm aware. Izuku's quirk pulls him to stand up. I'm going to head out now, I think. How should I contact you? Eraserhead asks. You probably won't. Izuku says. I'll give you a heads up when we need to talk. Next though, there's only silence on the other end. Izuku leaves the walkie-talkie on the ground where he'd been sitting. He covers his face with the golden mask again. Izuku is suddenly pulled by his quirk to the other side of the building. There's some plant, long dead, in a pot near the edge of the building. His quirk pushes him toward it, and he ends up with 2 large handfuls of wet soil. It had rained recently and it's mostly mud. Why is my life like this? He mutters to himself. He's pushed toward the lip of the building, and he winds up crouched under the railing. He sits there for 20 seconds before his quirk sends a warning. Then Eraserhead launches himself directly over where Izuku is sitting. Izuku stands up behind him and coughs. Eraserhead jerks around toward him, and Izuku sees the start of red shining through his goggles. Izuku throws the soil directly into his face. Eraserhead rears back, tearing away the goggles and falling into a defensive position. His face is completely covered in wet earth. Izuku doesn't even pause for a moment, and is immediately scrambling the other direction. He starts laughing without thinking about it. He probably sounds more than a little hysterical. Who leaves vents in their goggles? Doesn't that defeat the entire purpose? Also, the idea of a real pro hero thinking that Izuku is a threat is hilarious. Izuku jumps the few feet between the buildings. On the other side of that, he finds a fire escape going downwards and climbs down. Eventually he gets to the ground, winded but unharmed. Then he turns and goes deeper into the alleyway. He slips into a crevice between 2 dumpsters. It smells bad, but he doesn't move. A minute later, Eraserhead jumps down from the same building. He doesn't even use the fire escape, he just uses those bandage things to slow down his fall. He lands in a fluid motion. Eraserhead briefly looks around, then runs into the street, still looking for Izuku. Izuku spends a few minutes sitting still and waiting for his breathing to slow down. Then eventually stands back up and climbs up the fire escape. Just moments after he's gone, a police car slowly drives past the alleyway entrance. Izuku makes his way back to his apartment, sitting still and hiding just before the police, Eraserhead, or some other hero would have seen him. Eventually he gets back to his apartment and slips back in through the window. First things first, he takes a shower to get rid of any smell of dumpster or sweat that might remain. Then he gets himself a bag of chips because he's hungry. He sits on his bed and pulls out the flip phone from his desk. He opens it, replaces the battery, then once again carefully dials a number digit by digit with the help of his quirk. We haven't found him yet? Eraserhead answers instantly. I'm checking the 3rd quadrant now. Well, I could have told you that. Izuku says casually, mouth full of chips. Foresight? Eraserhead says. The one and only. Izuku answers, leaning against the wall. I was being polite before with the whole walkie-talkie thing. And yes, even if you change numbers I can call you. We'll find you. Nope, no you won't. It literally doesn't matter what you do. I already told you this. That's a bold claim. It's really not. Izuku says. Getting tired of the whole thing. It's just how it works. It doesn't matter what you do, what you try. In the end, this is true. I don't get caught. Start checking the information I gave you, it's a better use of your time. Izuku snaps the phone closed. Izuku's at school when he hears some other students talking about the UA Sports Festival. They're clustered around a phone, laughing and pointing at something. Izuku pulls out his own phone and looks up the event. Apparently it's happening right now. He should probably check that out sometime. His quirk pulls at him and he tucks his phone away. Hey guys. Izuku leans over to the other students and points to the door. They scatter away from the phone and go to their seats. An instant later the teacher walks in. Izuku has gained a reputation as the guy that saves people from getting in trouble. It was a little tiresome honestly. The rest of the students liked him, but he didn't talk to them much. He just wasn't really interested in the same things that they found interesting. He turns to pay attention to the teacher. The rest of the day passes, and Izuku walks back to his apartment. When he's back, he lays on the bed and pulls up the sports festival recording. It's not super interesting to him. Some of the ways the students solve problems are cool, but that's about it. Then he sees Shoto and perks up. He looks cold and disinterested. He blows away most of the competition. Kind of makes Izuku cringe. Huh? Well, Izuku wouldn't want to describe his friend badly. But he does look cruel. Eventually the tournament bit comes up, and Izuku watches the fights. Which is when he notices that Shoto is only using half of his quirk. He knows that Shoto can use both fire and ice. He'd helped Izuku light a bonfire for some yard debris once. What? Izuku watches through the whole tournament. Shoto wins the first few fights relatively easily, but the final round starts poorly. At that point Izuku gets distracted by the guy he's fighting against. He's got an explosion quirk and looks familiar. Izuku looks up his name and realizes that he actually knew that guy. He was one of those annoying kids who bothered him in elementary school. Kaken. Bakugo. Izuku's pretty sure their moms had been friends for a while. Man, he'd been a violent kid. Weird that he's going to be a hero. Maybe he'd changed over the years or something. Izuku hadn't talked to the guy for a long time now. Izuku plays the video and realizes that Bakugo is definitely still just as violent. He winces at some of the explosions that he sends at Shoto. But Shoto never uses his fire throughout the fight, and he ends up losing. Izuku watches the awards ceremony out of a sort of morbid curiosity. Bakugo looks incredibly angry, which is weird, since he just won the tournament. Izuku closes the video, then stares at the ceiling for a while. He kinda wants to talk to Shoto. He hadn't for a while. Not since he'd stopped working as a gardener. Though he had run into him at the USJ actually. The conversation might be awkward, but he did want to ask about the whole ice and fire thing. He pulls out his crime phone and goes to the messages app. His quirk seems to hesitate, then it pushes at his fingers. He types in a phone number, then opens a chat with it. He changes his name in the conversation from Sparky to Izuku. Izuku, yo. Hey dude. Nice show today. Good job getting second. Who's this? Izuku. Oh yeah, I worked as a gardener for you for a while, and I saw you at the USJ last week. Sorry for it being awkward. There's a few minutes of nothing and Izuku wonders if Shoto is going to respond. Are you a villain? Izuku. No. I'm not. I just needed to be there. It was like a whole thing. I actually sent the heroes a message that you guys were being attacked. Laughing face. That seems beyond the realm of just being a whole thing. Izuku. Pegasus. Anyway, I sent the message on Twitter if you want to check it out. My username is Foresight2020. It just ended up being the best way to make things work out well. I'm glad that no one got seriously hurt. There's a few minutes of silence. Izuku thinks that Shoto might be going through his Twitter to see if he was telling the truth. Izuku doesn't mind Shoto's checking. It's better than if he just trusted Izuku at his word. You warned Hawks a few hours before the attack? Izuku. Thanks. Izuku. Oh yeah. My name is actually Izuku by the way. I thought that maybe you should know that. Nice to meet you Izuku. Izuku. Speaking of that guy you fought at that last tournament battle, Bakugo, I went to middle school with him. Izuku. Yeah. Small world, right? He was kind of a lot back then too. I didn't know he was planning on being a hero. I think he talked about it as a kid, but lots of kids talk about how they're going to be heroes. That is interesting. Izuku. Yeah, laughing face. So anyway, I was watching your match today and you were great. I did have a question. No pressure though. Todo. What question? Izuku. Why aren't you using your fire side? Shoto doesn't answer immediately. The silence lasts long enough for Izuku to make himself dinner. He's sitting down to eat when Shoto finally responds to him. Todo. It's Endeavor's fire. I'm not going to use something that's his. Izuku. I don't mean to disrespect your beliefs or anything, but that's kind of dumb. Izuku waits a minute but Shoto doesn't respond, so he continues. Izuku. Like, what if there was a civilian in danger, and if you didn't use your quirk, it would lead to them getting hurt or dying? Your refusal to use your quirk would put them in danger. Plus it's not your dad's quirk, it's yours. Like it just is. But if you treat it like it's your dad's quirk, then you're making it into his quirk by treating it as such. There's no response. Izuku finishes his dinner and cleans up. When he's going to bed a few hours later, there's still no answer. He frowns at his screen, then shrugs. This is more up to Shoto, not Izuku. He can make his own decisions. Izuku goes to sleep. Todoroki Shoto's life has been turned upside down. For years it had been the same thing. His life had been school, training, and sleep. He'd wake up, go to school, go home, train until he could barely stand, do his homework until he was completely mentally exhausted, then go to sleep. Rinse, repeat. Then his gardener had changed that. He didn't know anything about the guy. Just that he worked odd times, could talk about anything for hours, and had a truly inspiring ability to avoid Shoto's father. It was almost magic. If Shoto just followed him around, it was like Endeavor just didn't exist. Dozens of times, his gardener had moved seemingly for no reason, only for Shoto's father to appear where they'd been moments before. Shoto has some theory that the gardener had a hearing quirk or something similar but had never actually asked. That was something Shoto had found comforting about the gardener. He rarely asked Shoto questions. Not about his quirk, or scar, or even his pro-hero father. He just talked about flowers and acted like anything that happened was completely normal. When he did have something to say that he knew Shoto wouldn't like, he was always careful how he said it, and what he said was often right. And that was before his gardener had led Shoto to reconnect with his mother. Shoto still couldn't figure out if it had been intentional or not. But somehow, everything had just lined up around that day that he'd found himself seeing his mother for the first time in years. He decided that it really didn't matter why his gardener had done what he did. Shoto had been sad when he'd quit. Much more than he'd expected. Part of it was admittedly that following the gardener had let him avoid his father. But Shoto had actually enjoyed the company. Fuyumi had also been sad. Especially since she hadn't gotten to say goodbye. She hadn't said much, but Shoto could tell that she was disappointed by the whole thing. Then things got weirder. On what was supposed to be a routine trip for him and his classmates, they'd been attacked by villains. They'd been separated across the huge facility and Shoto had fought real villains for the first time in his life. Then he'd seen his gardener. He'd just taken care of the last of the villains who'd been attacking him when he'd heard something behind him. He'd been about to send an ice spike at them when he'd seen the gardener's face. Shoto had thought it was just a trick of his stressed mind, but that was before the gardener called Shoto by name and waved at him. It had taken Shoto far too long to realize that he had been dressed just like the villains and there really was no innocent reason why he would be there. But by the time Shoto reacted, the gardener was gone. When Shoto had examined the building he'd disappeared into, he'd found nothing but an open back door. He'd tried searching through the woods around the area and found nothing that could answer his questions. But only a few minutes afterward, the pro-heroes had finally arrived. Shoto probably should have said something, but no one had asked Shoto, "Hey, did you recognize any of the villains?" And so Shoto hadn't said anything at all. He did wonder at the timing of seeing the gardener only just before the heroes arrived. He didn't know what to make of that either. Then came the day of the sports festival. It had gone all right. He hadn't won, but he'd come close. But that night, when he was holding an ice pack to his bruises and scrolling through his phone, he'd gotten a text. It had been from an unknown number. He'd almost ignored it, since it was probably just someone who'd watched the festival and found his number somehow. But he'd responded anyway. He'd felt something between horror and happiness when he'd learned that it was the gardener. But he wasn't surprised. Something about the gardener seemed to attract weird things happening. Shoto had learned to just accept that sort of thing as it came at this point. Shoto probably shouldn't have believed anything that he said. But Shoto had liked him when he'd worked at the house. And he still liked him. Plus he owed him for helping him reconnect to his family. So he listened to him. Shoto didn't really understand what was going on with him, but he was pretty sure that, all things considered, he was on the side of the heroes. And he told Shoto that his name was Izuku. Shoto was pretty sure that Izuku wasn't the name that he'd given Shoto when they'd met. So later Shoto had checked the family's records and found that he was right. He wasn't sure if he felt betrayed that Izuku had lied to him, or grateful that he'd told him the truth when he had no reason to. It had also given Shoto a way to check if Izuku was telling the truth. He'd asked Bakugo if he'd gone to school with someone named Izuku. At first he'd got nothing but insults and taunts. But eventually Bakugo did say that there was a kid named that at his elementary and middle school. Bakugo described him as weird and quiet and that he constantly would change his hair color. Shoto had taken that as confirmation that Izuku had given him his real name. Then Izuku had to ask about Shoto using his fire side. He'd been angry at first, but eventually that had faded. Now it was more a quiet consideration. He really did have a point. And Shoto had found himself lying awake at night, thinking about what he would do if someone died because he wouldn't use his fire side. He'd relented, a little bit bitter about the whole thing. Somehow, his gardener had ended up being one of the most influential people in his life. And he still wasn't sure how. But he'd started using his fire quirk during training exercises. Unfortunately, Shoto still had to deal with his father. After the sports festival he'd chosen to intern with him. He knew it was logical. Pro-hero endeavor was just about the best he could hope for in terms of internships. And not choosing him even though he could would just be petty. Though Shoto did want to do it. Things had been as strained as usual. Until the attack on Hosu. Then things had gotten very, very chaotic. Shoto stood in the main square, working with his father and the rest of the heroes to fight the strange monsters who'd shown up. He glances up from the fray and sees Izuku. He's standing on the edge of the plaza, hands in his pockets, watching the chaos and fighting like it's a sports game he doesn't know the rules to. Shoto hesitantly raises his hand and waves at Izuku. Izuku sees him then. He smiles widely and waves back. Like people weren't being terrorized by monsters in the plaza between them. Izuku makes a come here gesture with his hand. Shoto glances around, but none of the other heroes are paying attention to him at the moment. Shoto glances at his dad, then at Izuku. It's an easy decision. He jogs across the plaza to where Izuku is standing. "Hi Shoto," Izuku says, smiling widely. "It's good to see you again. Hope everything's going well. How's your mom been?" Shoto takes a second to adjust to the fact that nothing in the entire world is capable of phasing Izuku. He looks like this is the same as any day. He's wearing the same clothes he would wear to work back before. His hair is dyed black. He's got on another one of his backpacks. "Hi Izuku." "She's doing well. She says it's a shame you're not working for us anymore," Shoto says. "But right now there's a bunch of monsters attacking people right here." Yeah. Izuku looks at the monsters crawling across the plaza. Then he grabs Shoto's arm and pulls him back away from the mess. They go maybe 10 feet. Then a monster is thrown through the wall they've been standing in front of. It lays there, dazed, half buried in the debris from the building. Izuku says, peering around Shoto. "What is that?" "I don't know," Shoto says with a shrug. "Oh, okay, whatever, it'll probably come up later," Izuku says, then starts walking in the opposite direction. Shoto follows him without thinking about it. Years of practice following Izuku to avoid his father make it seem natural as anything. "Where are we going?" Shoto asks. "I'm not actually sure. But I think it's important." Izuku pulls up his sleeve and shows Shoto his arm. There are lines running along his skin, emanating from a point on the back of his wrist. They're dark green and glitter almost reflectively. Then run up his arm and curl around his elbow. The more lines there are, the more important it is. I think. Shoto spends a while thinking about this. This sort of thing seems natural to Izuku. Like this is just how the world's arranged. When something's important, his arm is covered in lines. Shoto decides that asking Izuku more questions will probably only lead to more questions and drops the subject. He follows Izuku a few blocks, until they find a small alleyway. As they're approaching, Izuku pulls on a golden mask. It covers his entire face. Shoto can just see his eyes through the dark holes in the mask. When he sees Shoto looking at him, he gives him a thumbs up. Inside is the hero killer Stain. And he's standing above one of Shoto's classmates. Ida. He doesn't seem to be moving. Is just laying there. There's another body laying on the ground on the other side of the alley. Shoto hopes they're not hurt. Who's that? Izuku asks. He's standing with his hands linked behind his head, looking into the alleyway with vague curiosity. That's my classmate. His name is Ida. Shoto says. That's your classmate? Izuku hisses. Then he seems to see Ida for the first time. Oh, wait, the guy on the ground? I thought you meant, never mind. That's the moment when Stain finally turns around to look at them. His face distorting into something inhuman. Who are you? Can't you see I'm doing something important? Murder? Izuku says, like it's a guessing game. He starts walking into the alleyway. Oh, I know you from something. You're that Stain guy, I saw you on the news. You kill people. That's messed up, dude. Don't, Ida shouts from behind Stain. This is my fight. Shoto's glad that his classmate's not dead. But that was a weird thing to say when you're lying on the ground under a villain about to kill you. That's the moment when Stain leaps up at them. Shoto grabs Izuku's arm and hauls him backward. He falls like a pug down a flight of stairs, tumbling and rolling a little. But Shoto can't quite focus on that for the moment, since Stain is trying to kill him. The hero killer moves absurdly quickly. Shoto jumps away from him and dodges the slices of his blade. Stain quickly lands a hit, and slices a long cut along Shoto's calf. He sends a flood of fire at Stain, who jumps backward. Shoto immediately regrets doing it, when he realizes that he's just sent Stain directly to Izuku. But somehow he doesn't die. Izuku has lined himself up right behind Stain. He grabs the bloody knife from Stain's hand as he regains his footing. Izuku takes a few steps back, and Stain pulls out another knife. Izuku dodges. Somehow, he's reacting so fast that it almost seems like he's moving before Stain begins his attacks. Each swing of Stain's knife is lightning fast, slicing through the air with unimaginable speed and accuracy. Shoto had access to both ice and fire, and years of training, and he'd only avoided a few attacks. Somehow, Izuku is dodging every single one. Even though it looks like he's falling down a flight of stairs, each step somehow seems accidental, and once he even trips in such a way that Stain's knife slices an inch off of his hair instead of his fingers. But Stain doesn't land a hit for long enough that Shoto can send a pillar of ice between the two. Stain leaps backward and crouches with his back to the wall. Izuku slips on the ice and lands flat on his back. Shoto runs to him and offers him a hand up. Thanks, Izuku says. Shoto pulls him to his feet. Izuku actually looks phased now. His breathing is fast and he's finally actually paying attention to the enemy. Shoto finds this both reassuring and terrifying. Then Izuku pulls a fire extinguisher from his bag and sprays the cut in Shoto's leg with it. Even Stain is quiet for a few moments. Why did you just do that? Shoto asks. I honestly have no idea. Izuku mutters. He uses the fire extinguisher to spray down the knife and flicks it onto the ground behind him. It just seemed like a good idea? I see. Since you know my quirk then? You know that if I taste your blood, then I can paralyze you. How clever of you to figure it out so quickly. Izuku says quietly. Then he shouts, I didn't know that. Thanks for telling me. Stain freezes. Shoto thinks that the look on his face could crack concrete. Then Izuku turns, walks a dozen feet toward the entrance to the alley and starts climbing a dumpster, like it was the most normal thing in the world. Who are you? Stain asks. There's rage on his face, but there's also something like wariness. Like he thinks that Izuku is a little more than he seems. Shoto agrees with that sentiment. He's currently having the same realization. Meh. No one you've heard of, Izuku says. Then stands on his toes to wrap a hand around the ladder of a fire escape, then jerks it downward. It makes an awful shrieking sound, then rolls down to the ground. The whole thing looks like it's mostly made of rust. I go by foresight. This isn't really my normal gig though. But I found myself around, so I figured. He shrugs, then reaches for his backpack. That's the moment when Stain attacks. It's shockingly fast. Shoto doesn't even have the chance to start pulling at his quirk. Izuku once again reacts instantly. He jumps toward the fire escape ladder. He manages to hang on, but awkwardly swings his body around. The fire escape makes a truly awful sound, then the whole thing begins to tear away from the wall. Time slows down for a moment, and Shoto realizes he's in danger just in time to start jumping backward. A wave of tangled metal and dust falls down around Izuku. It feels like the whole alley is collapsing around them and Shoto can barely keep track of what's going on. Then Shoto lurches forward, afraid that Izuku's been crushed by the metal. But when the dust clears, Izuku is sitting on the dumpster, not even scratched. The dumpster itself had been partially crushed by the weight. He leans forward, trying to get a look at the huge pile of rubble that blocks most of the alleyway. There's a sound from underneath the rusted pile of scrap that had been a fire escape just moments before. Shoto takes a few steps forward. Under the pile he sees a pair of terrifying eyes, staring at him. "I'll kill you. I'll kill you all." Stain hisses. Izuku climbs down from the dumpster. He's not graceful the way that most heroes are. Like he doesn't do things like this often. He just stumbles off the dumpster and barely catches himself with his hands. He reaches into his bag and pulls out the fire extinguisher. "So his quirk paralyzes people after he tastes their blood, huh?" he asks, crouching down in front of the pile. "Hey guy, you should probably close your eyes and mouth. Google says this stuff is a bit toxic." Then he sprays down the hero killer with a fire extinguisher, taking care to get each one of his weapons. That should keep him from managing that again, at least I think that's the point. He shrugs and packs the fire extinguisher away. "I should probably head out." He pats Shoto's shoulder and wanders back to the mouth of the alley. Shoto trots to keep up with him. Once Izuku's out of sight of the alleyway, he pulls off the mask. "You're leaving?" Sorry," Izuku says, rubbing the back of his neck. Shoto realizes that Izuku doesn't have a single scratch on him. He looks exactly the same as the beginning of the fight. But heroes are probably going to show up soon and all that. "Oh," Shoto says. "Yeah, that makes sense. Nice to catch up again." "Yeah," Izuku says, smiling bright. He holds his hand out for a fist bump, and Shoto hesitantly reciprocates. He takes a few steps away, then pauses and looks back at Shoto. Could you, not tell anyone my name?" he asks, almost sheepishly. "You could tell them I said my name was Foresight, but I've got this whole thing going on, and it might be an issue if dash." "Sure," Shoto says with a shrug. He didn't really mind. Something about Izuku's weirdness made it seem like the normal rules shouldn't apply to him anyway. "I'll see ya." "See ya," Izuku says with a bright smile. Then he starts jogging away in a seemingly random direction. Shoto stares back at him, then walks back into the alley with his hands in his pockets. He pulls out his phone, then glances through all the twisted metal at Stain. The hero killer is covered with fire extinguisher foam and still trapped. But his expression is curdling and intense. Plus his face is just creepy. Shoto shifts away uncomfortably. He wanders over to Ida and the other hero, just for the sake of staying away. Shoto sends out an emergency beacon to other heroes and sits next to the other body he'd seen in the alley. He looks like a hero. Shoto checks his pulse and finds that he's alive, though unconscious. Shoto starts wrapping the cuts in bandages, trying to muster up all his first aid knowledge. Who was that?" Ida asks. Whatever he'd been dealing with before seems to have been backburnered to focus on the total mess of confusion that is Izuku. "Foresight," Shoto says. Apparently, it takes a few minutes for the heroes to arrive. In that time, the paralysis over Ida has finally run out, and he helps Shoto wrap the other heroes' injuries. Shoto wraps the shallow cut on his calf and helps Ida with his own injuries. Then Shoto's father is there and there's lots of shouting. When Shoto shows them the hero killer trapped under a pile of metal, there's even more shouting. When they ask what happened, Shoto says that a civilian approached him and asked for help. He'd followed and found Stain along with the other heroes. When he explains that the civilian had then taken down Stain with a fire escape, the reactions had mostly been disbelief. When Shoto says that the civilian called himself Foresight, the questions change and become more pointed. At one point he repeats the whole story to a rapt audience of reporters and cameras. Eventually Stain is carted away. Shoto and Ida are taken to a hospital. Shoto listens to his father talk at him for a while, then goes to sleep. It was nice to see his friend again. Circumstances notwithstanding. The next day, a number of heroes and detectives have endless questions about whom Foresight is. Shoto deals with the interviews with slow breaths and patience that rivals nations, even when one of the heroes who interviews him is his homeroom teacher. Shoto's patience is tested, but he keeps Izuku's secrets. His quirk sends him to the store, where he gets some silver hair dye and a new contour palette. He gets the idea. He spends an hour or so getting ready, putting on baggy flamboyant clothes and subtle heels that give him a few inches of height. Then he carefully applies makeup that makes him look years older than he is. He dyes his hair and looks in the mirror. With the makeup and new hair color, he's close to unrecognizable. Suddenly he's struck with an idea funny enough that he totally needs to do it. He pulls out his palette and starts creating a rather realistic scar which starts from the bottom of his right ear and crosses the bridge of his nose. He leaves enough red tones and layers of foundation to add some texture. He adds some bags under his eyes and sprays some makeup setter on his face. He thinks the result is rather good, and it makes him fairly certain that even if someone saw him after this, they would be unlikely to pick him out of a crowd. Time for a show then. He makes his way across the town and finds a nice place for a dinner of teriyaki and rice. Then, at just before 8, he makes his way to a street he's never seen before. The place is some seedy-looking bar, set under the level of the street. He settles his shoulders, then realizes that he has no desire to be serious, and it would probably be best to convince them that he's an idiot. Or insane. Well, perhaps he should channel a bit of leader. He laughs at the thought, trying to feel guilty and failing. He's pretty sure that leader is a poor role model for actual villain behavior, but at the very least, it would make him seem somewhat unhinged. He bounces on his toes, then starts to whistle a tune under his breath before loudly slamming the door of the bar open. He must have interrupted something as the group of people standing inside violently turns toward the door. It's an interesting group. Nearest to the door is a man and a woman who he hasn't seen before. The man is tall, with dark clothes and black hair. His face and arms are covered with discolored and painful-looking scars. He looks relaxed but predatory. The woman is blonde and wearing a school uniform. She has sharp teeth and eyes that shine with a manic light. Behind them is another man, who Izuku recognizes. Shigaraki. Behind the bar of the counter is the man made out of smoke. Kurogyri. Salutations, fellow villains. Izuku shouts, bowing deeply before bouncing to his feet. It is an honor to meet me. There's a long moment of silence. Who the fuck are you? Shigaraki asks. Language, Izuku says, scandalized that the man would curse around a 15-year-old. I am the overlord of knowledge. I can know anything I wish. They just give him blank looks. I take it you have not heard of me. That is acceptable. Izuku says. You see, my quirk lets me know things about people. Izuku leans into the role. It didn't matter if nothing he said was factual. He was acting and he was going to be the overlord of knowledge. But the looks that Izuku are getting are only hostile and incredulous. For example, you two, your names are Shigaraki Tamura and Kurogyri. Izuku pauses then adds, not real names, but I wouldn't want to break any confidentiality. Safe bet that they'd use fake names. You recently attacked a number of students of UA, but were unable to complete your objective to kill All Might. Even more hostility now. Subject change time. But enough about myself. I believe that I've taken your spotlight for far too long. I must admit that your attack on the USJ was quite impressive regardless of its outcome, quite beyond my own ability. Izuku says, gesturing towards Shigaraki. Now, I believe that it is time for business. Izuku hoped that it wasn't clear to the villains that he had no idea what the business that he was referring to actually was. Shigaraki's hostility evaporates. He seems pleased with Izuku's praise. As I said, we're going to do what Stain wanted to do. What he couldn't accomplish before he was captured. We're going to destroy the heroes. His face really is creepy now that Izuku can see it up close. Oh, Izuku says, leaning forward. Stain was a true example of honor. He believed in everything that he ever said or did. I know, sighs the woman dreamily, there's just something about the original that you can't meet. What a man. And those murders in Shikoku? Masterpieces? She sighs and slumps into one of the bar chairs. I couldn't agree with you more. Izuku says. There's something about his drive. It's just inspiring. Shame he was captured, a great loss for the community. That guy. Shigaraki mutters. Who cares that he was caught? The Nomu attack was much more damaging and widespread. But is anyone talking about that? All they want to talk about is Stain and Foresight. Fucking NPCs. Izuku files away Nomu as the name of those monsters that were attacking before he found Stain. Then the scarred man grabs Izuku by the scruff of his jacket. Hey! The woman interjects. We were talking. Before we get into that, the scarred man says. How did you know that this meeting was taking place? Izuku doesn't bother with trying to escape. The grip on his collar is strong enough that Izuku doesn't like his chances of breaking it. But he shifts around until he can see the man's scarred face. Well, I told you, didn't I? Izuku says, trying and failing to shrug. I'm the overlord of knowledge. And anything that I want to know I can know. Really? The man says. He holds Izuku up with one arm and lifts him up to eye level. What is it that you know exactly? Izuku stares at him. Not sure what exactly he's supposed to do. His quirk is doing something strange. It's curling around his arms in a geometric pattern. He feels it curl up his arms, along his neck. He can feel the vines climbing up and around his face. Sharp and focused. The scarred man sees the vines around Izuku's face and his eyes narrow and his grip tightens. Smoke starts rising from his jacket shoulders. Izuku's got to know the answer, right? His quirk wouldn't leave him with nothing. He stares up at the villain. Then something clicks. Smoke, and thus a fire quirk. And there's something in the face. It's scarred, and now that Izuku's close he can see clearly that his hair is dyed. It's not naturally black. And Izuku knows who this man looks like. The family that this man looks like. He's got Todoroki Rei's eyes. He's got a face like Shoto. His eyebrows are the exact same color as Fuyumi's. The Todoroki, because Izuku knows that's what he is, seems uncomfortable with Izuku staring directly at him. Did you know, Izuku says slowly, smile stretching too wide across his face, twisting along with the vines, that your brother finally visited your mother? The first time in years. His scarred face tightens. Izuku's smile grows. And that he's been avoiding your father? The Todoroki drops Izuku. Izuku lands gracelessly on the floor, and ends up sprawled across the ground. His smile remains fixed in place across his face. He laughs from his position on the ground. The vines tuck themselves back away, curling back into the twin freckles on his wrists. Then he pulls himself off of the ground. The Todoroki steps away from him, like he doesn't want Izuku to touch him. There's blue fire crawling along his shoulders now. Izuku stretches and yawns. Man, that was a good one. Izuku glances back at Todoroki. You've got quite the family history, you know. I can kill you. The Todoroki responds. I'm aware. Izuku says, then he bows politely. Please place full trust in my confidentiality. Your history is your own. Then he turns to the rest of the villains. Do you require your own demonstration? Izuku asks sweetly. I'm sure I could try my power with you also. He's met only with silence. Shigaraki's hands are clenched. Even the unhinged woman is staring at Izuku with a wary gaze. The silence grows longer, which is the moment when the TV in the corner turns on. Izuku looks at it as the sound of static starts blasting. Then a voice comes out. I see that you have an unusual gift, says a deep and rasping voice. Izuku glances around, the Todoroki and the woman seem surprised. But Shigaraki and Kurogiri are just focused on the screen. Izuku bows theatrically to the screen. Thank you, your praise speaks well of your discernment. Izuku says, unsure of what else to say. I must ask you though, what exactly drew your interest to this group? There's something calculated lying just under the question. In cases of people being just a little too interested in you, lie. Izuku is reminded of those files he found. Of that story of two great powers, heroes and a villain working against each other for years. Izuku doesn't know where the thought came from, but he does know one thing. He has a whopper of a lie. Some of it's almost true even. Ah, I see, you might have noticed that I've not revealed this yet, Izuku says, pressing his hand to his chest. But he lets the tension and attention build. There is another reason that I want to join your cause. This reason is one of my own, Izuku says. The vigilante who goes by the name Foresight. The attention of the room snaps like a whip. That fucker that warned the heroes about our attack. Shigaraki hisses. Who took down Stain and stole our spotlight? The very individual. Izuku agrees. He is my sworn enemy. It is my greatest mission to work against him. After I learned that he was working against you, I thought that there is no better ally than the enemy of your enemy. I see. The voice from the television says thoughtfully. Until recently, this Foresight has been hiding under the notice of all of us. I take it you were doing the same? Quite so. Once he revealed himself to the world, I knew that I had to do the same. Izuku says. You say that you can know all, yet you seem to know little of your greatest enemy. Izuku faked controlled outrage. I assure you, I am Foresight's most potent enemy. Izuku paused, staring into the wall. But he knows me, and our quirks are the perfect foils to one another's. Mine tells me of the past and present of what is nearest to me. His tells him of things far away and in the future. Our conflict has raged long years. But nonetheless, your long conflict speaks of a lack of power on your part. The voice says. What use is an ally without power? Izuku simply nods. Then let me prove myself to you. Izuku says, then flounders because he has no idea what he's supposed to do. Fake his own death? Fight the fake villain version of himself? There's something that I want you to get for me. The voice speaks. Something that is rightfully mine, but was taken before I could collect it. What is it? Izuku asks. An important relic. It once rested in a museum. But it was stolen months ago. Recently, the police learned who it was. There's controlled rage in that tone. Through my contacts, I have learned that it was the individual who calls himself Foresight. Izuku happens to know exactly what this item is. The memory stick. Currently, it's in one of his dresser drawers. And he now knows exactly who this person on the screen is. Because his quirk would only draw him here for one reason. This was the villain All For One. And Izuku is exactly where he needs to be. He swallows. The knowledge of exactly how many heroes this villain has killed rising up in him. So this was what his quirk had been working toward. It was bringing him to All For One. Ah yes, Izuku said, smothering any feelings but those of the villain overlord of knowledge. I know what it is that you want. And I will spare no expense in bringing it to you. Izuku is ushered out quickly after that. He makes promises that he will have the memory stick soon, and is left alone on the street. He stands outside, feeling the vines unfurling and creeping along his skin. They brush against his chin and twirl in pleased patterns across his back. His quirk is thoroughly satisfied. But Izuku only feels the first hint of dread rising up. This was getting big. Bigger than he'd ever expected. But his quirk knows best. His quirk will protect him. It knows exactly what it's doing, right? Aizawa Shoyuta wants to bang his head into a wall. He's been working on the Foresight case for 6 hours now. Detective work wasn't his normal wheelhouse. But this vigilante was related to the villains who'd tried to kill his students, so he had a bit of a personal stake in the whole investigation. The first problem was that Foresight seems to have only now appeared. He could find no mention of any vigilante, villain, or hero ever using the name. He'd looked into the museum that Foresight had mentioned during their conversation, and found a report of a fairly uninteresting break-in. Apparently the thieves had set a firework to distract security and had snuck out in maintenance uniforms. Nothing else had ever come of it, and after insurance came around, no one had thought to thoroughly follow up the incident. Still, Shoyuta sent out feelers to his contacts, trying to see if there had been anything especially important in that museum, but feeling that it might just be another dead end. There was no mention of the name of the thieves in the report, and Shoyuta couldn't even be sure that Foresight was telling the truth about being the one who'd robbed the museum. Other paths of investigation hadn't given them anything either. They'd pulled the record of the phone which the vigilante had used to contact them. They'd found a match on a flip phone with a prepaid SIM card that had been bought 3 years ago. They'd pulled the call record and found that the first call that it had ever made was the one to Hawks, then just after the attack, the call to President Nezu, then the one he'd made to Shoyuta. They'd gone to the corner store that it had been bought from, but the camera records had long been erased and the cashier remembered nothing of the purchase. The most frustrating part was that the vigilante did seem to be giving them good information, but most of it was impossible to verify. He'd freely given them information about the villains. And from the investigating they'd done so far, all of it had been true. But they still couldn't really confirm anything. Kurogiri had been a headache to track down, but they'd found a match. He was a known criminal with a quirk that exactly matched what they'd seen at the USJ. But Shigaraki Tamura hadn't matched anything that they could find. But it was more than they'd found from any other source. Worse for Shoyuta, personally, was that Foresight had saved the life of one of his students. Shoyuta had ignored the clear signs that something was wrong with Ida, and it was only because of Foresight that Ida was alive at all. Not only that, Foresight had apparently lured Todoroki to the scene as well, putting another one of Shota's students in danger. That, even more than the fact that Foresight had launched himself into being a household name by taking down Stain, was what was bothering Shoyuta. If it wasn't for Foresight, his student would be dead. And he still didn't even know if he could trust Foresight. It made Shoyuta want to bang his head into a wall. Shoyuta pulls up the recording of his conversation with Foresight. He's listened to it a dozen times, hoping to get some clue of who the vigilante is. Shoyuta rubs his eyes and sighs. He isn't getting anywhere. He needs a break. He stands up from his desk. He's been using a small office in the police station. Lend it to him while the investigation is ongoing. It's fine enough for what he needs. He leaves his phone and papers out on his desk. It is an ideal security procedure, but he's confident enough of the police headquarters security. He shoves his hands in his pockets and slumps through the police offices. It's a little busier than he prefers, but he can deal with it. He gets to the public lobby and glances around. There's the normal lines of people. A couple of beat cops, nothing out of the ordinary. He's about to step outside, and is shuffling the things in his pocket to pull out his wallet when there's something loud behind him. He turns and sees some woman shouting at one of the officers. He watches to see if he should step in. He's distracted and maybe sleep-deprived, but he still reacts strongly when he feels someone run into him from behind. He turns quickly, arms shifting to grab at the offender, ready for a fight like any hero would be. The kid who's just run into him falls on his ass. It's not graceful either. Shota's arm had pushed him away and the kid makes a desperate attempt to grab at Shota's hand, but doesn't get a good grip and just unbalances himself. His arms pinwheel, then he trips on his own feet and lands flat on his back, winding himself. Shoyuta stares down at him. The fight's still going on behind him, and little attention is paid to the two of them. The kid looks up at Shoyuta, trying to get his breath back. He looks a few years older than Shota's students. He's got silver hair which might be dyed and is arrayed in unruly curls around his face. His face is plain, something that Shoyuta honestly wouldn't pick out of a crowd. He also is laying on the ground because of a feat of clumsiness Shoyuta thought children grew out of by that age. His kids would never do something like that. The kid's finally pulling himself off of the ground. Wow. The kid finally says. His expression is a little shocked, which is understandable. Sorry, Aya. Wasn't looking where I was going, I guess. Ahaha. Shoyuta remembers that he's supposed to act like a hero. Are you alright? He says. He thinks that maybe that should have had a little more inflection, but he's tired, okay? Aya. Are you okay? The kid tugs at his clothes. Yes. Shoyuta, now that the kid is moving on his own power, decides that he's had enough of the conversation. I've got to go now. I would suggest watching where you are going in the future. Will do. The kid says, smiling weakly. Sorry. Shoyuta just nods, and finally gets out of the building. He tries to forget it, but something about the kid had been off. He isn't sure about what it is, but he decides to put it out of his mind. He finds a place that sells ramen, and tries to relax for a while. Izuku leaves his apartment and heads to the store. He buys a small bag of disinfectant wipes, a strong magnet, a pen, and a box of Ziploc bags. In his pockets he has his RFID emulator. He's wearing nondescript street clothes and a bit of makeup to make him look a few years older than he is. He's also got on a jacket that's just a bit too long at the sleeves, leaving his hands covered. He follows the directions of his quirk until he finds the building it's guiding him toward. He stares up at it for a long moment, sure that his quirk can't be serious. Izuku stares up at the police station. Or at least that's what he's pretty sure this is. But this is a little weird. He tugs his clothes into order. Then he feels his quirk tug at his wrists, and he readjusts his sleeves until they're pulled most of the way over his hands. Izuku takes a deep breath and walks through the doors, shoulders firmly in place. There's a bit too much going on at once. There's a bunch of people inside, and there's someone shouting. Izuku glances around, trying to catch sight of what's going on. Then he runs into someone. The man shifts around quickly, like he'd been tense and ready for a fight. His arm knocks into Izuku's chest, and it sends him reeling backward. Izuku's quirk sends an impulse and his hand snatches forward before his brain even begins to process what's going on. He feels his hand close around the man's, then feels it steal something from his grip. Then physics takes over and Izuku begins to tumble backwards. He windmills his arms, trying to keep himself from falling, then his feet tangle together and he's suddenly on the ground. His back impacts the ground and the breath leaves his lungs in a rush. It really hurts and it takes him a few moments to finally catch his breath. But even while he's distracted, he feels his hands moving at request of his quirk. His hand slips something shaped like a credit card into his loose sleeves. Izuku finally can breathe and looks up and sees the man he'd run into. He really hopes that his fall hadn't looked as undignified as it had felt. His breath stutters. That is definitely Eraserhead. The last time Izuku had seen him, it had been dark and chaotic. And the man's face had been covered in mud, but this was definitely him. Izuku's mouth moves for a moment, not sure what he should say. The man looks kind of tired and annoyed, but mostly like he wants to be anywhere else but right here. But the hero doesn't seem to actually know who Izuku is. So Izuku decides he will definitely try and keep it that way. Izuku pushes himself to his feet, conscious of the credit card thing in his sleeve. Wow. Izuku says, wincing at how winded he still sounds. Sorry, but what should he say? Wasn't looking where I was going, I guess. Ahaha. The hero looks profoundly uncomfortable. Are you alright? Eraserhead says with absolutely no inflection. Yeah. Are you okay? Izuku asks. He tugs at his clothes, trying to push the card thing further into his sleeve. Yes. Eraserhead says, looking past Izuku at the door. I've got to go now. I suggest watching where you are going in the future. Will do. Izuku says weakly. Sorry. Eraserhead just nods, then walks out through the door. Izuku is left staring at his back, and then the closing door. So that went alright, all things considered. Izuku glances around. There are a couple people still looking at him, and he ducks his head and settles down on one of the seats in the room. He spends a few minutes calming down and looking at the room around him. It's a lobby for the police station. There are more than 24 people there. There's a door in the back that draws Izuku's attention. He watches as one of the cops goes to it, scans some sort of card, then walks in. So that's the way into the back of the building. Probably where the official stuff happens. His quirk draws his attention to his wrist. And to the card thing in his sleeve. He pulls it out and looks at it. It's plain white. No name, no numbers. He flips it over in his hand, then glances up at the door. So, Izuku had just stolen the hero's keys. Basically. He snorts. Then his quirk pulls at him again. Izuku slips the card into his pocket, then stands up and stretches. Izuku had expected to go to the door, but it brings him to a water cooler instead. He thinks that maybe his quirk is having a breakdown or something, but fills a paper cup a quarter up with water. This time the pull on his wrists pulls him to the door. He almost walks through it, but his quirk pulls him away. He leans against the wall next to it and pulls out his phone. He flips through random apps for a minute, then a couple of cops walk through the door. They don't notice Izuku. They walk through the lobby then out the front door. Just as they leave, Izuku's hands pull at him. He pushes off the wall, pulls the card from his pocket, then scans it at the reader in the door's lock. He holds his breath, then the light flashes green and the lock clicks. He opens it and walks through. It's not really as exciting as he hoped. The walls are pale and beige. There are cubicles and some people talking down the hallway. Izuku shoves his hands into his pockets and follows the pull of his hands through the hallways. Twice, he stops and leans against a wall as someone walks past. But no one pays much attention to him. Eventually he finds a small door in the corner of the building. His hands tug at him and he pulls out the card and presses it to the electric lock on the door. The small light blinks green and the lock clicks. Izuku opens the door, glances around, then sticks his tongue out at the police station. Take that. He slips inside and takes a look around. It's a dull-looking office. Kind of small and without much resembling decoration. There's a small flower pot near the small window and Izuku steps closer to check it out. It's not quite in bloom and looks a little bit sad. He pours the water he'd gotten earlier into the pot, then shifts it to the other side of the windowsill so that it'll get a little more sun. He sets the empty cup next to the pot. Then he turns to give his attention to the desk. There's a phone and a couple of papers scattered around. He picks them up and looks through them. They're investigation reports. They list all the things that Izuku has done as foresight. He finds records of them investigating his phone, along with a transcript of his conversations with them. There's a lot about him taking down Stain too, including what looks like a transcript of an interrogation of Shoto. Izuku feels a little bit bad about that. Okay, this is interesting. But what should he do here? He picks up the phone and clicks on the screen. It has a default home screen. He follows the push of his Quirk and types in the 6-digit passcode. He swipes through a couple emails and realizes this is definitely Eraserhead's phone. He sets the phone down and sits down on the chair. His Quirk pulls again, and Izuku takes out his flip phone. He dials a number, digit by digit, then pushes the call button. The phone on the desk rings. Izuku stares at it until the ring stops and his phone tells him to leave a message. He spends a few moments trying to think of what he should say, then shrugs. Hey Eraserhead. Seems like you left your phone in your office. Your plant was looking a little rough, so I watered it by the way. Anyways, I'll just leave a message. So, just a general update. I've gotten more information on those villain guys. They're still planning on killing All Might and all that. So that's an issue. They're recruiting more villains now. So watch out for that, I guess. Izuku stares at the ceiling, thinking of what else he should say. Oh yeah. Also, another thing that you should know. There's this guy working with Shigaraki, he calls himself Overlord of Knowledge. Yeah. Who even comes up with a name like that? Anyway, the guy absolutely hates me. He might try and get at me. So watch out for that. He's got an information gathering quirk and just really doesn't like me. Anyway, that's about it. Have a nice day. I'll see ya. Izuku hangs up. Alright. Well, that's done. He packs the phone away, then takes out the RFID emulator. He presses the buttons that his quirk instructs, and then presses the hero's ID to the device. It makes a happy beep sound. He packs both away again, then is pulled toward the computer. He logs in with a long password that his quirk gives him, then uses the RFID emulator and presses it to the reader on the computer. It unlocks. So it seems that Izuku now has a passable copy of a hero's pass to get into police records and buildings. Might be handy. His hands pull him around the computer, and he enters into some computer database, then creates a new entry. He pauses, then his quirk starts pulling at his fingers. It's a little awkward, but he follows the pull of his fingers to start typing. The witness reported seeing a villain who called himself Overlord of Knowledge. The entire interaction only lasted a few minutes. The witness did not get a clear view of the villain's face, but describes him as short and wearing bright clothing. The villain claimed to have taken something that no one would notice missing, but did not clarify further. No objects were found missing during the ensuing investigation. Izuku entered the text, filled a few text boxes with numbers and letters that he didn't know the meaning of, then backdated the entry to 11 years ago. And then created a few more entries. He also added small bits of text to already existing records. The informant added that there was some mention of a villain known as Overlord of Knowledge said to be active in the area. The informant has no further information about this individual. The prisoner mentioned a villain known as Overlord of Knowledge, who had reportedly hired a number of other criminals over the last few years. And so on it went. The whole thing took less than 20 minutes. When it was all done, there were more than a dozen mentions of this fictional villain in the police's records. All entries were backdated, with the earliest being over a decade ago and the most recent being a few months ago. Izuku pulls away from the computer, then feels a tug from his bag. He brings out the magnet he'd bought, then feels a tug toward the large computer sitting on the ground. He pushes out the chair, then sits cross-legged on the floor. His hands twitch and press the magnet to one panel of the computer. There's an odd sound from the monitor on the desk and Izuku looks up at it. The screen is glitching and jumping around. Izuku moves the magnet across the computer, and the screen frizzes before changing to a disconnected screen. Izuku passes the magnet across the computer a few more times. He leaves the magnet on the computer and reaches up to the monitor. He tries to connect it to the computer and nothing comes up. So Izuku bricked the hero's computer. For some reason. But his quirk is pulling at his hands again, so there's more important things to think about. Izuku grabs one of the papers on the desk and pulls the pen from his bag. Izuku feels a delicate pull on his fingers and starts to write. It's awkward, the tugs at his fingers make his penmanship look truly atrocious, but he ignores that. He's writing out a series of names. Nothing that Izuku recognizes, but most of them have titles like detective or officer before them, so Izuku thinks they have something to do with the police. Once his quirk is satisfied, the list is around 24 names long. Izuku waits, but his quirk doesn't give him any more instructions. He shrugs and adds a doodle of a snake at the end of the page. Finally, Izuku's quirk fully pulls back, and he stretches his hands above his head. Well, that was pretty good work. He turns off the monitor, then set Eraserhead's ID card in the center of the desk. He then takes the disinfectant wipes from his bag and cleans anything he'd touched while in the office. Once that was done, he stands with his hands on his hips and nods. Good work. He has no idea why he'd done it though. Maybe he'd figure it out sometime. Izuku slips out of the office, leaving the door open a crack behind him. After most of an hour spent trying and failing to relax at the ramen shop, Aizawa Shoyuta gives up. He pays and heads back to the police headquarters. As he's walking into the building, Detective Tsukachi flags him down and walks in with him to the back of the station. The conversation is mostly them rehashing the same fruitless leads, and he soon decides to return to his office. As he approaches his office, he sees that the door is slightly ajar. The hairs of the back of his neck rise. This is wrong. This shouldn't happen. He was sure that he'd closed it. Worry rises up in his chest. Had he left it open? He'd left his phone in the office. He takes a few more steps and enters. Everything seems the same. Maybe he just made a mistake. Then he sees his ID card on his desk. Had he lost it? Had someone returned it to his desk? Why didn't they just return it to him? He grabs it and stuffs it into his pocket. Shoyuta picks up his phone and sees that there's a new notification. The worry returns. It's a voicemail. He plays it. Hey Eraserhead. Seems like you left your phone in your office. Your plant was looking a little rough, so I watered it by the way. Anyways, I'll just leave a message. It was a familiar voice, one that Shoyuta had been examining recordings of for dozens of hours. The vigilante Foresight. He pauses the message. Foresight had known that he wasn't in his office. That his phone was there. The vigilante. Shoyuta glances up, and for the first time notices the plant on the windowsill. It looks sad and wilted, and there's a paper cup sitting next to it that Shoyuta knows wasn't in here when he left just an hour ago. The vigilante had been here. Shoyuta is reminded of that kid who'd run into him. Who'd seemed a little off, a little familiar. That's the moment when he finally puts it together that the voice on the recording is the same as the kid's voice. The hairs on the back of Shuta's neck stand up and his quirk activates without him meaning it to. Shoyuta had seen Foresight. Had literally run into him. The vigilante must have taken his ID during his fall somehow. The vigilante had planned his moves so carefully. Had been exactly where he needed to be and understood Shuta's routines enough to perfectly slip past him and get into the police station. He'd grabbed Shuta's ID without Shoyuta noticing. Just to get into Shuta's head. Or maybe not. Maybe he had some other plan. Shoyuta hates this. Hates this so much. He clenches his hands and stares at the phone. Pushes down the irrational urge to throw it at the wall. Or leave the station to go hole away in a safe house somewhere. Instead, he steps out of the office and closes the door behind him, then continues listening to the message. So, Just a general update. I've gotten more information on those villain guys. They're still planning on killing All Might and all that. So that's an issue. They're recruiting more villains now. So watch out for that, I guess. There's a few seconds of pause, like the vigilante is considering whether he should say the next thing. Oh yeah. Also, another thing that you should know. There's this guy working with Shigaraki, he calls himself Overlord of Knowledge. Yeah. Who even comes up with a name like that? Anyway, the guy absolutely hates me. He might try and get at me. So watch out for that. He's got an information gathering quirk and just really doesn't like me. Anyway, that's about it. Have a nice day. I'll see ya. The message ends. Shoyuta glances around his temporary office. This is wrong. This is terrifying. This single vigilante knew far too much for Shoyuta to trust him. But he calms himself and sends out a message that there's a contamination hazard at his office. Within minutes, a team is sent to sweep Shuta's office. But they don't find anything. No bombs, nothing hazardous, no bugs or recording devices. Nothing that explained why the vigilante had gone into Shuta's office in the first place. They do find that his computer has been bricked completely, apparently with the magnet which had been left on the computer. A touch Shoyuta took to be mocking. The texts tell Shoyuta that they couldn't be sure why Foresight would have bricked the computer. The data there is automatically backed up, though the data of the computer's message traffic would be lost. Had the computer been used to send a message? One from Shuta's account? That was impossible. The vigilante would have needed Shuta's password to even open the computer. More questions. No more answers. Shoyuta still makes the techs look through the police database for bugs or viruses. They find nothing. When he finally returns to his office, he notices something written on the back of a police report. Shoyuta knows that he hadn't written it, especially with the doodle of the snake at the bottom. It's a list of names. It takes him a few moments to recognize one. He's an officer at the precinct. Shoyuta doesn't know him well, but had worked with him before. A quick search reveals that the rest of the names are all police-affiliated. Shoyuta can't make sense of it. More questions. He folds the list and stuffs it into a pocket. Then, out of an abundance of paranoia, he decides to find himself another office. Once his account is set up on the new computer, he gets to work. He copies the voice message Foresight had left to the project file. Then takes a scan of the list of names Foresight had written and adds it to. Then he listens to the message again. At least he has a lead now. He runs a search on the name Overlord of Knowledge on the police system. No surprise, more than a dozen results come up. Nothing concrete. Just witness accounts of seeing or hearing of a villain named Overlord of Knowledge. Shoyuta starts a new file on the villain, linking the witness accounts and adding in any information that comes up. There's a number of reports, but no clear leads to who the villain is or what he can do. Shoyuta closes out of the file and stares at the ceiling. He still doesn't like anything about this. The way that this vigilante seems to always be 2 steps ahead of them. Seems to be infallible. Doesn't even seem to be trying most of the time. According to the interviews with Todoroki, he'd taken down Stain without even a scratch. Shoyuta finds himself almost wanting to trust the guy, just because having him as an enemy was proving such a headache. Each attempt to catch the vigilante had been a resounding failure. So much so that Shoyuta suspects he was just humoring their attempts. Shoyuta is considering just going home to start an early patrol, when his phone rings. For an instant, he's convinced that it's another call from Foresight, but this time there is a caller ID. Sir Nighteye? Shoyuta wastes 2 rings of the phone just trying to figure out why the other hero would be calling him. They worked in the same circles, and Shoyuta is passingly familiar with the other hero. But he can't think of why Sir Nighteye would be calling him. Shoyuta answers the phone. Eraserhead speaking. This is Sir Nighteye. Is it true that you know the vigilante who robbed the early Quirk-era museum? Shoyuta is so thrown off by the question that he says nothing for a moment. Did you get confirmation? Nighteye asks again. If it really was him, then I might be able to offer some explanation for his actions. Yes. Shoyuta says instantly. Finally, someone with information about Foresight. Well, he claimed that it was him who'd done it. We don't have confirmation beyond that. Does it matter? Yes. Yes, it does. I believe that he's sending a message. To who? Shoyuta asks. Already starting the paperwork to add Sir Nighteye to the investigation. All might. Izuku pulls himself out of bed somewhere around noon on a Saturday. He brushes his teeth, eats breakfast, and puts on some clothes. Then his quirk pulls at him and he learns that apparently he's going out today. It doesn't tell him to put on makeup or anything, but it does tell him to stop by the convenience store near his house and pick up a miniature first aid kit. He packs it away into his bag and heads to the bus station. He rides for a while and eventually reaches the same neighborhood where he'd met with the group of villains in the bar. He gets out and heads toward a different street. He has just enough time to wonder what he's supposed to do when he sees one of the villains. It's the scarred one. The one who's a Todoroki. He's dressed in dirty, dark-colored clothes. His hood is pulled up and he's leisurely walking down the street. He nears Izuku, who takes that as his cue. Izuku jogs a bit and then falls into step next to the Todoroki. He looks at Izuku like he's going to murder him. But Izuku is pretty sure that's just the guy's default look. Hey, how's things been? Izuku asks. The Todoroki does a double take when he finally recognizes Izuku. You're that guy with the stupid name? What the hell are you doing here? Talking to you. Izuku answers honestly. Why? Izuku just shrugs. And why do you look like a 12-year-old? The Todoroki asks, looking at Izuku with unsettling intensity. And where'd that scar go? I'm 15, not 12. Izuku corrects. And the scar was just makeup? What the fuck is your problem? Language. Izuku answers. And I just thought that it would be a good idea to talk, since last time there were those other guys there. The Todoroki stares at him. So, what's your name? Izuku says. I don't think I caught it last time we talked. Dabi. He says eventually. Dabi seems about to say something. But Izuku sees a boba shop. Oh, there's a good spot. You like boba tea? Izuku asks. I've never had it, Dabi says. He seems a little wary, though Izuku couldn't say why. Great. Izuku leads them to the shop. He orders for both of them and leans against a counter to wait. Everyone in the store is glancing or openly staring at Dabi. It's probably his general air of looking like he's about to kill everyone within 50 feet of himself. But he doesn't say a word, just stands there staring at Izuku. It's a bit awkward honestly, but then Izuku's name is called and he goes to the front. Izuku grabs his drinks. And at a prompt from his quirk, he also grabs a couple of napkins and stuffs them into his bag. Izuku elects to bring them outside. They sit on a table looking out on the street. Izuku takes a sip of the boba and is pleased to note that it's pretty good. He's not really sure what the next step should be here. But his quirk isn't giving him much direction at the moment. Well, honesty is the best policy. Partial honesty anyway. Along with whatever lies he thinks up along the way. So I lied to those villain guys before. Izuku opens. Dabi chokes on his drink. Yeah. I know, but what can you do? Izuku says with a shrug. And you're telling me because? Dabi asks. I'm one of those villain guys, and I can just tell them that. Really, you're going to tell Shigaraki? Izuku asks. That guy? Dabi flexes his hands like he's resisting strangling Izuku. Just tell me what you want, kid, Dabi says. Izuku nods. So, my power's not really knowing everything, that was a total lie. Dabi looks wary. You demonstrated otherwise, he says. There was a dangerous intelligence in those eyes. Underneath the goth clothing and massive swaths of scars. Well, about that, I really didn't, Izuku says with a shrug. Like, the thing with your family, right? Not a quirk. I was your dad's gardener. Dabi's boba tea leaks out the top with the force of his grip. What? Izuku pulls the napkins out from his bag and hands them over to Dabi, who takes them in a tense grip. Yeah, I worked there for a couple years, Izuku says, nodding. It's a nice enough gig if you stay away from your dad. Pays good too. Plus your siblings are pretty easy to get along with. Dabi doesn't say anything. He just stares at Izuku. So yeah, no omniscience. I just noticed that you look, like, a lot like your family and figured that it probably wasn't a coincidence. Dabi takes a few breaths. Then he uses the napkins to wipe the boba off his hands. Why, and I feel I'm going to regret asking this, did you decide that you were going to infiltrate a villain organization? Izuku just shrugs and takes a sip of boba. Well, I wasn't really planning on doing that at first, but then I just figured I might as well go with it. Dabi looks at him. You know that we can kill you, right? Oh yeah. Izuku says cheerily. You actually can't. That's part of the lie that I told before. You see, my actual quirk means that I can't get hurt. So no matter what happens Dabi is then moving so fast that Izuku barely has time to move. He pulls a knife and as Izuku's hands come up to block his face, swipes the knife toward Izuku. Izuku jerks back and grabs his left hand. There's a shallow cut through the meaty part underneath his thumb. It's over an inch long, just missing his inner palm. Oh, but, dude. Izuku hisses. It stings. You can get hurt. Dabi says pointedly. He tucks the knife away. Oh, not like. But, that's not what I mean. Izuku says. What the hell? This was not what he was expecting to happen. Then he remembers the first aid kit in his bag. So it was part of the plan then. He pulls the kit from his bag and thumps it down on the table. He takes out the antiseptic wipes and cleans the cut. That was so rude. Izuku mutters. He smears some neosporin on the cut and plasters a large band-aid over it. Then he packs the kit up and puts it back into his bag. So, as I was saying, no matter what happens, I'll be fine, so it doesn't matter if the situation is dangerous. Dabi stares at him for a long time. So you're just crazy? He turns away from Izuku and stares into the distance and mutters, he's just crazy. I'm literally right here. Izuku says. I seriously thought that you were a threat. Dabi says, his hand is at his forehead. I'm just like some guy. Why would you think I was dangerous? Izuku says, then brushes that aside. Anyway, since you stabbed me, I think it's fair that I ask you a question. Dabi sends him a sideways look. What is it? Why are you a villain? Like, your dad's a hero, and your brother's training to be one, why villainy? Dabi looks caught between frustration and wariness. I'm not answering that. Well, then I'll just figure it out then. Izuku says, he kicks his feet as he thinks. So, fire quirk. Similar to your dad. Based on Shoto, he probably trained you when Shoto was young. But now you're off doing your own thing and Shoto wants nothing to do with him. What? Yeah, Shoto hates training. Wants to be a hero but wants nothing to do with your dad. I've helped him avoid training with your dad like so many times. You've Dabi starts laughing. It starts shocked but soon turns hysterical. He's leaning on the table with his elbows and his forehead is resting on his palms. You've been helping him, dodge training? From the number 2 hero. Yeah. Izuku asks. Dabi looks like he's a nudge away from crying. Well, he doesn't want to train, so what else am I supposed to do? Dabi claps an arm on Izuku's shoulder. Yep, you're actually fucking crazy. It sounds almost complimentary. Language. I'm 15. Right? Dabi leans back away and settles into his seat. He takes a sip of boba, then makes a face and pushes it away. There's still some hysteria in his smile but he continues, so, why am I a villain, right? Right? So I was born with a pretty powerful fire quirk, Dabi says, leaning forward with a predatory gleam in his eyes. My father wanted someone to be his successor. So he trained me to be just as good as him. But the thing was, he wanted something more than that. Which is why he married my mother, who has an ice quirk. Because he hoped that their quirks would combine to something powerful. Oh no. That's terrible. Izuku's heart drops at the thought of the Todoroki's mother only marrying someone to create a child with a powerful quirk. Rei-sama doesn't deserve that. So then wait, Rei-sama? Dabi pauses. Yeah, she said to call her that. Izuku supplies. You've met my mother? Yeah. I brought her flowers. You know what, I don't care. Dabi looks a little like he does care though. Anyway, Shoto was born a few years after I started training. He basically has both of the quirks of my parents. Once my father saw that potential, he stopped wasting time on something like me. Dabi gestures to himself with a sneer. And moved on to training Shoto. But I still train by myself. I managed to cause serious damage to myself in the process. Izuku glances at Dabi's extensive scars. But no one gave a shit about what happened to the inferior kid. So I spent some time at the hospital by myself. Dabi pauses. He seems to realize how much he's been sharing and jolts. Anyways, whatever. I decided that there's no way to succeed the way I'd been going, so I went another way. Izuku sits there for a long moment, trying to understand all of Dabi's story. That was a hell of a reason to become a villain. Then he snorts. What? Dabi looks like he's thinking of pulling out the knife again. But don't get me wrong. There is so much messed up about the way that your dad treated you. Izuku starts. I mean, children aren't vessels to fulfill their parents' dreams. You shouldn't just choose one kid to pay attention to and ignore the others. But, like, that's all obvious, you know? Like, you know that the way you've been treated is just incredibly unfair and unjust. Dabi looks a little stricken. Izuku really hoped that Dabi already knew that. Anyway, I just think that you've gone the wrong direction. Dabi's face shudders into a leer. What, villainy is wrong and I should switch to the light? Well, sure, if you want to do that I guess you can, but that's not what I mean. Dabi pauses and stares at Izuku. What I mean is that you dealt with your dad abandoning you. But you dealt with it by obsessing over it and letting it take over anything else that could have happened in your life. Izuku gestures vaguely. You've just let him stick his hooks into everything that you do. Because of him still being the focus of your life, you can't move onward. Dabi's head jerks back in the tiniest motion. That's not real revenge, is what I'm saying. Izuku shrugs. Then looks away and takes another sip of his boba. Are you saying I should just kill him and be done with it? Dabi asks. He sounds more confused than anything. What? Oh no, please don't do that. Izuku says. He's not sure what's going to convince Dabi. Killing is wrong? Dabi laughs again, long and loud. And a little hysterical maybe. What is it that you mean then? He says once he's finally stopped. Izuku tries to remember what his point was. Oh well, I guess the best way to get revenge would be just to never let his legacy see the light of day. Shoto's already heading in that direction. He's going to be a hero, but is doing it separately from your father. Being his own person instead of just your dad's son. Dabi seems thoughtful, then shakes his head. What does that even mean though? He says, seeming frustrated. Well, you could do something really impressive all on your own. Like what? Take down that villain from the TV. Izuku wagers. Dabi freezes. Sensei? He asks hesitantly. Yeah, him. Izuku nods, kicking his feet as he gets into the idea. That'd be something that people would recognize, and they wouldn't even be able to connect what you do to anything related to your dad. Dabi's looking at Izuku like he's crazy again. Is that what you're going to be doing? Dabi asks. Yeah, I think so. Izuku shrugs. I'm not so clear on the details yet, but that's the direction that things are going. Dabi stares off into the distance. He seems to be thinking through some things. So Izuku leaves him to it. At least a few minutes go by in silence. Izuku just watches people walk past and lets Dabi make up his mind. You know what? Dabi says eventually. Let's do it. Let's take him down. I'm getting a little tired of putting up with Shigaraki anyways. He stands up from the table and stretches. Izuku smiles and gathers up his bag and their cups. Great, he chirps. I have no idea what's going to happen. Dabi looks at Izuku, then laughs again. Crazy, right? Dabi says resignedly. But he seems a little more focused now. There's something a little more grounded in his eyes. Like that edge of malice has been softened down the slightest bit. Izuku throws the trash away. Do you have a plan? At all? Dabi asks, trailing behind Izuku. Yeah, I do. I just don't know it yet. Dabi seems to take this as just the way that things are going to be now and nods. I'm sure that something will come up soon. Izuku offers in a conciliatory way. Dabi just nods. They part ways on the street. Izuku cheerful and Dabi thoughtful.